Welcome back to the Drowsy Historian, where we whisper you to sleep with tales so uncomfortable they'd make your mattress feel like a feathered throne. Tonight, forget castles, forget kings, because we're trudging through the ankle-deep mud of Eastern Europe right into the shack of someone you'll never find in textbooks, the medieval peasant. The real footnote of history, the forgotten labour force, the human scarecrow that fed an empire. Get ready to smell the wet hay, freeze in a burlap sack, and lose a toe to frostbite, all before breakfast. Let's begin, shall we? They didn't have surnames, just mud, cold, and the blessed gift of obscurity. Somewhere deep in what is now rural Slovakia, back when it was little more than forested feudal fiefdoms, you'd find a man named Luka, or Jarek, or just that skinny guy who doesn't own a horse. His village? Unmarked, no maps, no roads. Just a clearing in the trees with crooked thatched huts built so low you could barely stand up straight inside. It was the 1300s, but don't be fooled by the calendar. Time didn't exist in the way we know it. There were no weekends, no vacations, just seasons. If the snow melted and you didn't starve, congratulations, you were winning. Let's take a walk into his world. The bedroom? Just dirt with ambition. Luca's home was a single-room cottage made of wattle and daub, meaning essentially sticks and animal poop glued together with clay. The roof leaked. Always. It didn't matter if it was rain, snow, or bird droppings. There was always something damp falling on your head. Inside it was dim, smoky, and smelled like livestock because the livestock literally slept indoors with the family. Why? Because if they stayed outside, they'd be stolen or freeze to death. Or worse, become someone else's dinner. Beds didn't exist. There was hay, which was also shared with lice, fleas, and the occasional rat. Luka, his wife Marika, their 3 ragged children, and their 1 surviving chicken all slept together in a corner, more for warmth than love. Privacy? That was a luxury for nobles. Peasants like Luka didn't get privacy, they got pneumonia. Breakfast, if you're lucky, it's mush morning, began not with a stretch and yawn but a bone-deep ache and maybe a cough that you hoped wasn't tuberculosis. The day's first meal, if there was one, was a gritty porridge of millet or rye, boiled in a pot blackened by years of wood smoke. No milk, no sugar, no salt. Those were for people who could afford spice traders or had connections to the monastery. Occasionally, if the gods were merciful and a rat died near your trap, you might get some protein. But mostly, you ate whatever didn't kill you. Luca's teeth were half gone by the time he was 28. And that was normal. Now, get to work. Because that's literally your purpose. Peasants didn't have jobs. Their job was existence. And that meant working from sunrise to sunset, 6.5 days a week, till your hands bled or your back broke. Luca's main tool? A crude wooden plough tied to an ox that was probably sicker than he was. The land he ploughed? Not his. It belonged to the Boyar, a local noble whose idea of generosity was not whipping you during church feasts. Luca worked 3 days a week for himself, to not die, and 3 for the Lord, so he didn't get beaten or evicted. Sundays were for God, or more accurately, for obeying the local Orthodox priest who collected tithes Luca couldn't afford. Skip church, risk your soul and your legs. Bathing was rare. Soap was unheard of. If Luca bathed once a season, it was in the river, usually upstream of where someone else was washing a dead pig. Disease was rampant. Typhus, dysentery, lice infestations, you name it. Toilets, hole in the ground. Wiping, moss, if it wasn't frozen. And let's talk about those charming medieval winters. Imagine wearing a sack, not a coat, not fur. A literal sack layered with the skin of a goat if you were lucky. Luca's boots were repurposed from an older man who had frozen to death. Luca couldn't chop down trees. That was illegal. Forests were owned by the nobility. If he needed wood, he had to ask permission, or better yet steal it at night and pray no one caught him. Punishment for poaching timber? Fines he couldn't pay, lashes he couldn't avoid, or in the worst case death. Yes, you could die for picking up sticks. Let's pause here and appreciate the genius of feudalism. A system so backwards that it created a permanent underclass and told them God wanted it that way. You had no upward mobility, no education, no rights, and every time the weather failed or your ox dropped dead, you were blamed for your laziness. Religion was used not to uplift, but to oppress. Luca was told that working himself to death might get him into heaven if he paid the church with eggs and butter he didn't have. Convenient, isn't it? Oh, and peasants were expected to love their lord, because the lord protected them from what, you ask? From other lords, of course. Imagine this. Luca saves a year's worth of eggs to buy his daughter a goat. Then the local noble declares a new herding fee for livestock, takes the goat, and thanks Luca for his contribution to the manor. When Luca protests, he's fined for speaking out. Feudalism was basically a game of Monopoly where you start bankrupt and the winner is the guy who already owns the board. We followed Luca and Marika through these chapters, not because their story is special, but because it's painfully ordinary. Luca isn't a hero. Marika isn't a rebel. They're just trying to keep their children alive. Their life is a reminder that most people in history weren't kings, knights, or saints. They were cold, hungry, and ignored. And history? It stepped right over their corpses on its way to glorify a prince. By the time Luca stepped outside the next morning, the frost had already claimed the grass. His breath came out in thick clouds, curling in the freezing air like it was trying to escape the day ahead. His boots, stiff and cracked, barely clung to his feet. The leather was so worn that it creaked with every step. And still, he was one of the lucky ones. Some of the others in the village didn't even have boots. Just scraps of cloth tied around their ankles, like some sad joke the 14th century liked to play. The fields looked the same as yesterday, and the day before. Endless rows of frozen, stubborn earth stretching as far as your tired eyes could see. No tractors, no steel ploughs, no fancy gloves. Just a wooden yoke, an ox that limped more than it walked, and your own 2 blistered hands. That was the grand machinery of Eastern European agriculture in the 1300s. A peasant's version of industrial progress was managing to sharpen a rusted sickle on a rock without slicing off a finger. Work started before sunrise and ended when the sky turned purple and your knees gave out. Luca didn't think about dreams or goals. His only real ambition was to survive the week without getting sick or losing a toe. Maybe if the gods smiled on him, he'd bring home enough grain to boil into something vaguely edible. That was as good as life got. Anything else? Luxury. And just to be clear, this wasn't his land he was toiling over. It belonged to a local noble, a Boyar, whose name Luca barely dared whisper unless he was in a church or drunk enough to risk it. The system was simple, really. The Boyar owned the land. Luca worked the land. And then, as thanks, Luca handed over a big chunk of what he harvested back to the Boyar. Oh, and to the church. And to the tax collector. And by the time everyone took their share, Luca was left holding an empty sack and wondering why his kids looked thinner every month. This was the brilliance of feudal economics: work like a mule, pay like a prince, and still be treated like something stuck to the bottom of a noble's shoe. They called it corvée labour. That meant unpaid work demanded by your lord in exchange for the privilege of not being evicted from your shack. It was slavery without the chains because the law made sure you didn't need them. While Luca scraped away at the frozen soil, his wife Marika was back home running her own kind of marathon. She didn't get to rest just because she wasn't in the fields. Her world was smaller, darker, but just as brutal. Grinding grain by hand, scrubbing clothes in icy water, feeding the children whatever scraps she could find. And always, always cold. The hearth barely gave off heat, and they couldn't afford to burn wood too often. Not unless they wanted to get fined for poaching timber from the noble's forest. Yes, you heard that right. Picking up sticks could get you in trouble. Food, if you could call it that. Marika made bread from black rye flour so coarse it could scrape your throat on the way down. A slice of that, maybe a spoonful of boiled cabbage, or beans if they were lucky, and water. That was dinner. No salt, no fat, and definitely no meat. Meat was a fairy tale reserved for feast days, or for those rich enough to forget what hunger even felt like, and don't even think about getting sick. There were no doctors, no herbs beyond what your neighbour's cousin claimed might cure a fever, and absolutely no time to be unwell. Illness didn't wait for a day off, and there weren't any days off to begin with. If you were coughing blood or burning with fever, you worked anyway, otherwise your children starved. It was that simple. Religion? That was the one thing you were guaranteed, whether you liked it or not. The Orthodox Church towered over peasant life like a stern parent you were always trying to impress. They preached that suffering was holy, that pain meant your soul was on the right track. So, Luca and Marika paid their tithes, showed up to Mass, and kissed icons while their stomachs growled. The priests spoke in Church Slavonic, which neither of them understood, but that didn't matter. They nodded, they crossed themselves, and they gave what they could: eggs, wool, labour, even if it left them with nothing. And here's the part that really grates. Despite giving everything, peasants were still seen as lazy, sinful, ungrateful, as if they chose this life. As if they woke up one day and said, "You know what sounds good? Being permanently exhausted and covered in blisters while my lord drinks wine from silver cups." That was the kicker. You worked till your bones cracked, then were judged for not doing enough. It wasn't just unfair, it was a trap. A generational trap. Luca's father had lived like this. So had his grandfather. And unless something miraculous happened, his sons would live and die the same way. No schools, no letters, no laws in your favour. You weren't even allowed to leave the village without permission. Step too far from your lord's land and you were a criminal. Wander too far into the forest and you were a corpse. And yet, somehow, they endured. Luca still stood in those fields, still pushed that plough, still whispered to Marika under the blankets at night, still clung to some sliver of dignity that hadn't yet been beaten out of him. He still watched his children sleep with a kind of quiet pride, knowing he'd given them one more day. Because that's what peasants did. Not thrive, not rise, just endure. Chapter 2. Taxed to Death. The Boyar's Greedy Grip. If you think the endless labour and bitter cold were bad, just wait until someone knocked on your door demanding a third of your grain. Not as a loan, not as a favour, just because. Luca had barely finished dragging the last bundle of wheat into the corner of their leaky hut when the steward arrived. Not the noble himself, of course. The Boyar wouldn't dare set foot in the village. Too muddy, too smelly, too full of people who looked like they'd been crying for 3 generations. No, he sent a man in fur with clean boots and a cold stare, riding a horse that probably ate better than half the village combined. The steward didn't need to say much. Everyone knew what he was here for: taxes, dues, contributions to the manor. Call it whatever made the noble feel less like a thief. Marika stood in the doorway, clutching a cloth sack that held most of their harvest, her hands shaking, not from fear, just exhaustion. There was no point begging. You gave what was asked, or you watched your roof burn. It had happened before. Everyone remembered. And here's the thing, Luca didn't even really know what he was being taxed for. The land wasn't his. The tools weren't his. Even the ox technically belonged to the lord. But still, every fall they came to collect. Grain, eggs, wool, a chicken if you had one. They even taxed the oven smoke once, claiming it was proof of production. You think that's a joke? It wasn't. In some regions, just lighting a fire cost you silver, if you had any. The Boyars, those charming lords of the manor, believed peasants existed purely to fill their granaries and their pockets. It didn't matter if your child had fever or if your roof had caved in last week, they wanted their due. And if the harvest was bad, too bad, pay up anyway. You could always work off the difference, which usually meant being conscripted for a week of back-breaking repairs on the lord's estate. Without food, without pay. Generous system, really. And then came the church. Because, of course, God needed taxes too. Luca owed tithes to the local Orthodox priest, 10% of whatever he had. The irony was thick. The priest's robes were silk-lined, while Luca's shirt had more patches than original fabric. But question it? Never. Suffering was holy, remember? Marika tried to hold back a sob as she handed over 2 sacks of barley, half of what they had left. The steward gave a disinterested nod and made a mark on his scroll. And that was that. No thank you, no blessing. Just another tick in a long list of peasant names. Like inventory. Here's what made it worse. The Boyars didn't even farm. They didn't know the first thing about soil or seasons. Their hands were soft, their bellies round. They lived in stone manors with fireplaces and candlelight, while Luca's family shivered beside wet kindling, hoping the wind wouldn't blow their house over. And still, the system insisted the noble was superior, that he was divinely appointed, that Luca should be grateful for the opportunity to be exploited. If you had a cow, taxed. If you had a spinning wheel, taxed. If your wife gave birth, sometimes taxed for that too, because another child meant more future labour for the manor, and wouldn't that be lovely? And you couldn't say no. Refuse to pay and they'd take it by force, or jail you in a hole somewhere until your family paid double, or beat you in front of your neighbours as an example. Public punishment wasn't rare, it was policy. Fear was cheaper than fairness. What made it all the more absurd was how the nobles explained the setup. They called it order. They said the peasants needed leadership, structure, guidance. As if Luca would have gotten lost in the woods without a man in silk reminding him to keep starving politely. It was theft wrapped in tradition. Oppression dressed up as divine balance. And the people endured it, not because they were weak, but because every door to escape had been nailed shut centuries ago. Sometimes, in the rare moments when Luca allowed himself to think too much, he'd wonder what would happen if everyone just said no one day. If the whole village, tired and broken as it was, decided to stop, to fight back. But then he'd remember the stories of revolts crushed, of families hanged, of whole villages set on fire, and the thought would pass, not because he didn't care, but because he couldn't afford to hope. And that's how the system stayed intact, not with swords, not with speeches, but with the quiet acceptance of people who had been taught since birth that they were nothing more than dirt in human shape, replaceable, forgettable. So Luca did what they all did. He bowed his head, handed over his crop, watched the steward ride away with enough food to feed his family through the winter, and then went back inside and tried not to scream. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, Marika stirred the same pot of soup for the third time that week, adding more water, less flavour. The youngest son coughed in his sleep. Luca sat by the doorway and stared at the empty corner where the sacks used to be. This was life. And as unfair as it was also normal. And that's the tragedy, isn't it? By the time Luca turned 30, his back bent like a man twice his age, his hands calloused into thick cracked tools of labour, he had come to accept something quietly horrifying. He would never own a single thing. Not a patch of earth, not a corner of forest, not even the clothes on his back. Ownership, after all, was a nobleman's word, something soft-palmed boyars, tossed around while polishing goblets with linen napkins. For peasants like Luca, the only things that truly belonged to him were his blisters, his breath, and maybe, if he kept his head down long enough, his life. But even that last part was up for debate. You see, the tax system in Eastern Europe wasn't just aggressive, it was personal. It didn't care that you were hungry. It didn't care that your child was sick or that your roof had caved in last snowfall. It cared only that you existed, and therefore you owed. Owed what exactly? Everything. Rent for your tiny wooden hovel, fees for using the Lord's grain mill, charges for grazing your sheep, levies for entering the town market. And if you were lucky enough to have a horse, congratulations. That horse now tripled your dues. And it wasn't just the boyar poking holes in your pocket. The church came next, sleeves rolled up, smiling sweetly. The Orthodox clergy didn't ask if you had enough for yourself. They asked if you had tithed, if you'd brought your portion of eggs, or milk, or honey, or a lamb, if you'd been particularly blessed that season. Not tithing wasn't just frowned upon, it was treated like spitting in God's face. You could lose the sacraments, be shamed publicly, or worse, accused of heresy, which, depending on who was in charge, could land you in a makeshift dungeon or hung upside down for the crows to practice on. Marika knew this dance well. She had once failed to deliver her tithe of eggs during Lent, and the priest made an example of her. He said during Mass, in front of every soot-faced villager, that withholding from God was like denying breath to one's own children. She'd cried all the way home, clutching her scarf over her eyes so no one would see. But they had, and they remembered. Everyone always remembered when a peasant failed. It was a rigged game, of course. Even if the harvest was good, there were fines, arbitrary ones. Fence not straight. Chickens wandering onto noble land. Smoke too dark. They taxed shadows practically. One season, Luca had to give up half his barley harvest because a hunting party claimed they'd seen a peasant walking too close to the manor's edge with a sling. The irony? The man didn't even own a sling. He'd been gathering berries for his daughter's fever. Didn't matter. Fine levied, barley taken, case closed. And if a peasant couldn't pay, well, the options were charming. 1. Give up your tools or your livestock. 2. Take on labour service. Extra unpaid days spent repairing roads, stacking timber, digging ditches near the noble's estate, all while your own family's needs rotted back at home. Or 3. They'd start seizing your children. No joke. Teenagers were considered able-bodied labour and could be hauled away to serve in the manor, never to return. The legal system was non-existent. You were guilty the second a noble or priest said so. The Boyars, of course, painted a different picture. In their version of events, they were the protectors of order, the chosen few tasked with keeping the land civil. Without them, they insisted, peasants would collapse into chaos like sheep without a shepherd. A laughable claim, really. The only thing they shepherded was wealth from the villagers straight into their banquets. The hypocrisy burned deeper each year. The manor would hold feasts, boars on spits, wine flowing like rivers, music echoing across the fields, and the smell would drift toward the village, taunting them. Luca once told Marika that the smell of roast pork made him hungrier than the hunger itself. She nodded, quietly stirring a soup made from cabbage leaves and stale bread crust. There were moments, rare but real, when villagers whispered about revolt. Late at night, after a few shared sips of homemade kvass, someone would slam their fist on the table and say, "What if we just stopped?" But it never lasted, because everyone knew the stories. About whole villages razed, about men flayed in public squares, about women taken as punishment. Rebellion wasn't brave, it was suicide. The fear was baked into every part of their life. Parents taught their children not to look the steward in the eye, not to speak unless spoken to, not to walk too loudly past the manor fields. And so, generation after generation, the people stayed quiet. They endured. They passed down the art of disappearing in plain sight. Still, every now and then, Luca would sit outside his hut after dark, legs aching, and stare up at the stars. He'd wonder what lay beyond the forests, beyond the hills, lands he'd never see, roads he'd never travel. He didn't have words for it, really. It wasn't exactly a dream, more like a pulse, a little throb in the chest that said, "This isn't how it's supposed to be." But then the wind would shift, and he'd hear a baby cry, or the coughing of the sick old man in the next hut, and the moment would pass. He'd throw another twig on the fire, stolen probably, and shuffle back inside. Because no matter how unfair it all felt, Luca couldn't afford to care about justice. Not when survival took everything he had. Chapter 3. The Plough and the Whip. Labour without mercy. Work. That was the one thing a peasant in Eastern Europe could count on. Not fairness, not food, certainly not peace, just work. Back-breaking, finger-bleeding, soul-crushing labour that started before sunrise and ended when your body couldn't take one more step. And even then, you weren't done. There was always something else. Fixing the fence, digging a new ditch, grinding wheat, gathering firewood from a forest you weren't legally allowed to enter. You didn't finish work, you just paused long enough to not die. For Luca, it was the only rhythm he'd ever known. Wake up sore, bend down, lift, carry, repeat, no matter the weather. Rain turned the fields into ankle-deep soup. Snow froze the tools into the mud. Summer cooked your brain beneath a wool cap that smelled like damp goat. But you kept going because the land didn't care, and neither did the Boyar who owned it. Labour wasn't just hard, it was humiliating. It reminded you of your place every single minute. You weren't a craftsman, or a tradesman, or even a servant. You were muscle. A walking, grunting, sweating piece of livestock with a pulse. The noble steward didn't ask your name. He barked orders, flicked his whip if you slowed down, and moved on. You were seen the same way they saw a mule, useful but replaceable. And the tools? Laughable. A plough was nothing more than a crooked wooden shaft with a dull iron tip, if you were lucky enough to have iron. Most just used sharpened wood. Try breaking frozen earth with that and see how fast your spine starts to crack. The oxen were half dead from overuse, and most had mange, sores, or legs that trembled like reeds in the wind. When they collapsed, you didn't stop. You just grabbed the yoke and pulled it yourself. It was either that or go hungry. Women weren't spared either. Marika worked alongside Luca whenever she wasn't tending to children, weaving cloth or hauling water from the frozen creek. Her hands were thick with calluses, her back permanently hunched from years of lifting, bending and carrying. And when her time came to give birth, she did it on straw, with no help but a neighbour woman and prayer. Then she was back on her feet the next day. No rest, no exception. And the tasks? Endless. Harvesting rye with curved knives so dull they tore more than they cut. Threshing grain with flails. Basically big sticks meant to beat the wheat until the kernels gave up. You swung until your arms gave out. And if it was a good harvest, you worked twice as long. Because the more you reaped, the more they took. Then there was haymaking, cutting tall grass with a scythe under a brutal sun. It had to be dried, raked, tied, and stacked just right. Too damp and it would rot. Too dry and it would catch fire. Either way, you'd be blamed. Nothing was ever just done. Everything you did had a consequence waiting. But the worst part wasn't the pain. It was the silence. No one came to say thank you. No one rewarded you for a good day. At best, you got ignored. At worst, the steward would inspect your stack of grain, shake his head, and mutter something about laziness before docking your quota. You didn't get days off. There was no Sabbath, no sick leave. You worked unless you were bleeding or buried. And sometimes even then. Whips were a real thing too, not some metaphor. The overseers carried them openly, not as punishment, as motivation. A lash across the back for slacking. A strike to the calves for talking. Public beatings were common. Done right in the field so others would learn. Luca had seen men twice his size cry like children after a single strike. One wrong look, one shaky knee, and you'd get lashed with a rope stiffened from blood. And what did the Boyar do while all this happened? He hunted. Rode through the woods with a pack of dogs and a horn. Drank wine with imported spices. Hosted feasts with roasted game while peasants chewed boiled turnip peels. He didn't lift a finger. Didn't see the sweat, the blood, the crushed hands or twisted ankles. And if he did, he probably would have asked why the oxen weren't replaced faster. But here's the sick genius of it all. The peasants still believed in work. They took pride in it. Not because it got them anything, but because it was all they had. Dignity didn't come from rewards. It came from knowing you survived one more season, that your children, as skinny and sickly as they were, had one more bowl of soup. Still, there were moments when even that pride cracked, like the time a neighbour's son only 15 collapsed while hauling stones for a new manor wall. He was dead by sundown. Heatstroke, most likely. The steward called him weak and docked the family's next ration. Luca had stood there, teeth grinding, fists clenched, but he said nothing, because everyone knew what happened when peasants spoke up. You think this sounds like slavery? You're right. It was. They didn't call it that, of course. They said it was serfdom, a noble tradition. But it looked the same, felt the same, worked the same. Bound to land you didn't own, punished for choices you never made, and forced to smile at the feet of men who wouldn't notice if you starved. And the real punchline? Every village had a tiny wooden cross planted near the well, a reminder that God was watching, that all this misery had purpose, that if you endured enough, suffered deeply enough, maybe you'd get a reward in the next life. In the meantime, back to the plough. The older Luca got, the more his body began to betray him. His knees cracked when he crouched. His grip weakened on the plough. His eyesight blurred when the sun hit just wrong. But none of that mattered. His age wasn't measured in years. It was measured in seasons survived, harvests endured, and lashes avoided. You could be 40 and done, or 50 and dragging yourself through another cruel winter just because no one else could carry the load. There was no such thing as retirement for peasants, only collapse. And yet the system kept spinning. The labour, you see, didn't exist to serve the peasants. It served the manor, the boyar, the church, and the invisible machinery of power grinding away at every village across Eastern Europe. You didn't just grow food, you paid to grind it, literally. The village mill, often graciously, owned by the noble, charged a fee to use it. That's right. Luca would grow the grain, carry it for miles, wait in line, and then give up a chunk of his flour just to be allowed to make bread. Marika once tried to use a hand mill in secret, and when the steward found out, he confiscated their flour and docked their hay allowance for winter. Rules like that weren't rare, they were the norm, and they didn't just grind your grain, they ground your pride. Because for all the back-breaking work the peasants did, the only time they were recognised was when they were being punished. A crooked fence? Whipped. A spilled bucket of milk? Fined. A child wandering onto the noble's hunting ground, the whole family beaten in front of the village. These punishments weren't accidents. They were rituals. Power had to be seen to be believed, and nothing said, "Know your place," like watching your neighbour hang for stealing a turnip. Even the holy days were traps. You might think, finally, a break. A festival, a church feast, something joyful. But in practice, it was just more work, dressed up in religion. The peasants were required to clean the church grounds, prepare food for the priest, provide offerings they could barely afford, and stand in stiff reverence through sermons that promised salvation in exchange for more obedience. The irony was brutal. On the one day they were told to rest, they laboured harder to serve people who didn't understand the meaning of hunger. And let's talk about women for a moment, because if you think Luca had it bad, Marika was carrying twice the burden. She wasn't just a worker. She was a cook, a weaver, a mother, a nurse, a midwife, a laundress, a beekeeper, and, if needed, a field hand. Her day started before Luca's and ended after. She'd rise before the roosters, light the hearth, prepare whatever miserable scraps they had, clean the hut, tend the children, and still find time to patch clothes and scrape lice from the bedding. Then she'd join Luca in the fields, swing a scythe, haul buckets, and chase chickens back from the neighbour's fence before the steward noticed. And after all that, she was still expected to look humble in church and kneel with grace. It was exhausting in a way that defied language. And yet, she didn't complain, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew it wouldn't change anything. Complaining didn't fill bellies, it didn't fix roofs, it just made you a target. So, like most peasant women, she swallowed the ache in her back and pressed on. One of the more bitter truths was that children weren't really children. They were tiny workers in training. By the age of 6, they were expected to help herd geese, weed the gardens, fetch water, or babysit the even smaller ones. Education? A fantasy. The only learning they got was how to avoid punishment and how to carry things without dropping them. If a child showed curiosity or cleverness, the priest might suggest they become a novice, but only if the family could afford the bribe, which, of course, they couldn't. Now, every once in a while, there'd be a whisper, a tale from some distant village about a peasant who ran away, made it to the city, found work, maybe even owned land. But those were stories told late at night, like fairy tales. Luca didn't know anyone who had actually seen a city, let alone lived in one. The forest alone was enough to kill you. Wolves, bandits, hunger. And if you were caught, oh, the punishment for desertion was designed to send a message. Branding, mutilation, sometimes execution, all by the grace of God, of course. But the sickest part, the labour wasn't even productive. Half the time, fields were overused and underfed, leading to low yields. Tools broke constantly. Storage was poor, so grain rotted before winter. But the boyars didn't care. They just demanded more. And when things failed, it wasn't bad planning. It was God's will. Or worse, peasant laziness. As if Luca could control the weather with his peasant thoughts. And let's not forget the seasonal labour levies. Every year, nobles would request extra work for new roads, stables or fortifications. This meant days, sometimes weeks away from your land, unpaid, unsupported, while your own home fell apart in your absence. Your kids went hungry, your wife worked alone, and when you returned, you were scolded for not keeping up with your own field work. In a system that exploited every drop of your sweat, rest was rebellion. Still, Luca pressed on, not because he had hope, really. Hope was for poets. But because there was no alternative. Work wasn't a choice. It was his identity. If he stopped, even for a day, he ceased to exist in the eyes of the people above him. He'd become a problem, a burden, a target. So he gritted his teeth, rubbed his hands raw, and pulled the plough like his life depended on it. Because it did. And somewhere, deep down, beneath the ache and the mud and the humiliation, was a whisper, a thought he barely let himself entertain, that maybe, just maybe, there was more than this. That life shouldn't be a punishment. That labour shouldn't feel like dying with your eyes open. But he pushed that whisper down. He had work to do. The older Luca got, the more his body began to betray him. His knees cracked when he crouched. His grip weakened on the plough. His eyesight blurred when the sun hit just wrong. But none of that mattered. His age wasn't measured in years. It was measured in seasons survived, harvests endured, and lashes avoided. You could be 40 and done, or 50, and dragging yourself through another cruel winter just because no one else could carry the load. There was no such thing as retirement for peasants, only collapse. And yet the system kept spinning. The labour, you see, didn't exist to serve the peasants. It served the manor, the Boyar, the church, and the invisible machinery of power grinding away at every village across Eastern Europe. You didn't just grow food, you paid to grind it, literally. The village mill, often graciously, owned by the noble, charged a fee to use it. That's right, Luca would grow the grain, carry it for miles, wait in line, and then give up a chunk of his flour just to be allowed to make bread. Marika once tried to use a hand mill in secret, and when the steward found out, he confiscated their flour and docked their hay allowance for winter. Rules like that weren't rare, they were the norm. And they didn't just grind your grain, they ground your pride. Because for all the back-breaking work the peasants did, the only time they were recognised was when they were being punished. A crooked fence? Whipped. A spilled bucket of milk? Fined. A child wandering onto the noble's hunting ground? The whole family beaten in front of the village. These punishments weren't accidents. They were rituals. Power had to be seen to be believed, and nothing said, know your place, like watching your neighbour hang for stealing a turnip. Even the holy days were traps. You might think, finally, a break, a festival, a church feast, something joyful, but in practice, it was just more work, dressed up in religion. The peasants were required to clean the church grounds, prepare food for the priest, provide offerings they could barely afford, and stand in stiff reverence through sermons that promised salvation in exchange for more obedience. The irony was brutal. On the one day they were told to rest, they laboured harder to serve people who didn't understand the meaning of hunger. And let's talk about women for a moment, because if you think Luca had it bad, Marika was carrying twice the burden. She wasn't just a worker. She was a cook, a weaver, a mother, a nurse, a midwife, a laundress, a beekeeper, and, if needed, a field hand. Her day started before Luca's and ended after. She'd rise before the roosters, light the hearth, prepare whatever miserable scraps they had, clean the hut, tend the children, and still find time to patch clothes and scrape lice from the bedding. Then she'd join Luca in the fields, swing a scythe, haul buckets, and chase chickens back from the neighbour's fence before the steward noticed. And after all that, she was still expected to look humble in church and kneel with grace. It was exhausting in a way that defied language. And yet she didn't complain, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew it wouldn't change anything. Complaining didn't fill bellies, it didn't fix roofs, it just made you a target. So, like most peasant women, she swallowed the ache in her back and pressed on. One of the more bitter truths was that children weren't really children. They were tiny workers in training. By the age of 6, they were expected to help herd geese, weed the gardens, fetch water, or babysit the even smaller ones. Education? A fantasy. The only learning they got was how to avoid punishment and how to carry things without dropping them. If a child showed curiosity or cleverness, the priest might suggest they become a novice, but only if the family could afford the bribe, which, of course, they couldn't. Now, every once in a while, there'd be a whisper, a tale from some distant village about a peasant who ran away, made it to the city, found work, maybe even owned land. But those were stories told late at night, like fairy tales. Luca didn't know anyone who had actually seen a city, let alone lived in one. The forest alone was enough to kill you. Wolves, bandits, hunger. And if you were caught, oh, the punishment for desertion was designed to send a message. Branding, mutilation, sometimes execution, all by the grace of God, of course. But the sickest part, the labour wasn't even productive. Half the time, fields were overused and underfed, leading to low yields. Tools broke constantly. Storage was poor, so grain rotted before winter. But the Boyars didn't care. They just demanded more. And when things failed, it wasn't bad planning, it was God's will. Or worse, peasant laziness. As if Luca could control the weather with his peasant thoughts. And let's not forget the seasonal labour levies. Every year, nobles would request extra work for new roads, stables, or fortifications. This meant days, sometimes weeks, away from your land, unpaid, unsupported, while your own home fell apart in your absence. Your kids went hungry, your wife worked alone, and when you returned, you were scolded for not keeping up with your own fieldwork. In a system that exploited every drop of your sweat, rest was rebellion. Still, Luca pressed on, not because he had hope, really. Hope was for poets. But because there was no alternative. Work wasn't a choice. It was his identity. If he stopped, even for a day, he ceased to exist in the eyes of the people above him. He'd become a problem, a burden, a target. So he gritted his teeth, rubbed his hands raw, and pulled the plough like his life depended on it. Because it did. And somewhere, deep down, beneath the ache and the mud and the humiliation, was a whisper. A thought he barely let himself entertain, that maybe, just maybe, there was more than this. That life shouldn't be a punishment. That labour shouldn't feel like dying with your eyes open. But he pushed that whisper down. He had work to do. Chapter 4. The Feudal Noose. Born into bondage. Luca didn't remember the day he became a serf. Not because it was long ago, but because it never really happened. There was no ceremony, no declaration, no moment of choice. He was simply born into it, like someone waking up already buried under 6 feet of soil and being told to make peace with the view. His father was a serf. His grandfather too. His children would be. It was as guaranteed as winter frost and church taxes. And that's what made the whole thing so brutally efficient. You didn't need to convince people to obey when they'd been trained to kneel before they could walk. Serfdom wasn't slavery in the legal sense, but only because the law twisted itself into clever shapes to pretend it was different. In practice, it was bondage, a more polite form of human ownership wrapped in parchment and piety. The land wasn't yours, the tools weren't yours, your life wasn't even yours, it belonged to the Lord. He didn't just own the wheat you harvested, he owned your Tuesday, your kneecaps and your future. Try to leave, you'd be hunted. Try to rebel, you'd be flogged or worse. Even if you managed to escape into another territory, you'd have to live under a new lord who might treat you even worse. And if you didn't belong to anyone at all, well, then you were a vagabond. And vagabonds were criminals, filthy, suspicious, and usually hanged. So, being unclaimed was just another form of death. The word serf came from the Latin servus, meaning slave. That should have been a clue. But society was built on euphemisms. Luca wasn't a prisoner, they said. He was a dependent. He wasn't oppressed. He was protected. Protected from what? Starvation? Disease? Wolves? Because those were all things the system didn't protect him from. If anything, it delivered them with punctuality. And the binding wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. The church endorsed serfdom as a divine order. Nobles ruled by the grace of God. Peasants served by the will of heaven. Obey your Lord, suffer well, and maybe, just maybe, you'll get your reward in the next life. It was theological gaslighting. You were born into chains and told they were wings. Every village had its own silent scoreboard. Who worked the hardest? Who owed the most? Who got punished last? Who disappeared? Children learned these rules before they learned their prayers. Don't look the steward in the eye. Don't wander past the manor road. Don't ask questions when the priest is listening. These weren't superstitions, they were survival tactics. Passed down, not in books, but in bruises and whispers. Even marriage was bound by status. Luca hadn't courted Marika for love, though love eventually found its way in somehow between the shared suffering and the quiet meals. But he'd been allowed to marry her by the manor. You couldn't just marry anyone, you needed permission. Sometimes the Lord chose for you, especially if he had an economic plan for the families. And if you married outside your village without approval, that was betrayal. Some nobles fined such unions, others tore families apart. The most insidious thing about the system was how it reshaped identity. Serfs didn't see themselves as individuals, they were of the manor, of the land. Luca wasn't just Luca. He was Luca of Varich, field hand of the Boyar's north plot. That title was his name, his worth, his boundary. It told others what he could do, what he couldn't, and where he'd die. And yes, die. Because death didn't free you from the system either. When Luca's father passed away, his plot didn't pass to him automatically. It had to be approved. His tools were reviewed by the steward, and part of the family's grain was seized as a death fee. Even dying came with a tax. Worse still, when a serf died, there was no grave with a name. Just a hole, a prayer, and dirt. Sometimes not even that, if the priest was busy or the family couldn't pay the fee for a proper burial. So bodies were tucked into the tree line, or buried shallow, or left for the elements. And yet, no one protested, because who had the energy? There were rebellions, of course, here and there, little sparks. In Hungary, in the Polish crown lands, in Wallachia. But they were always crushed, brutally. Heads on spikes, fields salted. Whole villages vanished from the records like they never existed. And that silence, that absence, was louder than any scream. It reminded the survivors, don't even think about fighting. And so, Luca did what they all did. He endured. Day by day, he dug, he carried, he fed the ox. He watched his children grow, too thin and too tired, and wondered if they'd ever know a life beyond this. Would his son pull the same plough? Would his daughter marry at 14 just to survive? Probably. The tragedy was, Luca wasn't lazy. He wasn't stupid, he wasn't weak. He was just born too far down the ladder, and the rungs above him were greased with centuries of blood and scripture. And still, even as he bent under the yoke, even as he handed over his harvest to the steward with numb hands, he kept that flicker, that little ember. That thought, dangerous as it was, that maybe this wasn't the only way things had to be. But for now, there were potatoes to dig and debts to pay, always debts. It was a strange thing, this idea of ownership. Luca had tilled the same stretch of land for 25 years. He had fertilized it with his sweat, sowed it with calloused fingers, and harvested its grain with a bent back and aching arms. And yet, if asked, he'd tell you plainly, it wasn't his. Not the soil, not the hut it fed, not even the handful of seeds he saved at the end of each season. All of it, technically and legally, belonged to the Lord. This truth sank its teeth deepest when it came to inheritance. The notion that a man might pass something, anything, down to his children was laughable under the Boyar's law. When a peasant died, there was no automatic transfer of property, because there was no property to transfer. Luca remembered this too well. When his father passed, the steward showed up within the day, not to offer condolences, but to take inventory. The plough, the ox, the grain stores, even the cooking pot, they were all catalogued. A portion was claimed as a death fee, a noble tradition ensuring that the manor got first pickings before the family could mourn. And should there be a dispute over who got to continue using the land, the Boyar decided, not the family, not the village elders. the Boyar, or more accurately, whichever rotund steward he trusted to make peasants cry quietly. This system made sure that no one ever truly rose above their rank. Even the hard-working, the clever, the resourceful, especially them, were kept in place. If you somehow managed to save a little, breed a few more pigs, grow a second row of rye, it wasn't seen as commendable. It was suspicious. It meant you had too much, which meant you were due for an inspection, followed by a tax hike, or a fine, or the sudden appearance of a soldier claiming you owed 3 weeks of labour to repair a broken fence on the manor grounds. The social mobility ladder? It didn't just have missing rungs, it was nailed to the ground. And while we're on the subject of broken systems, let's talk about court justice. Not royal courts, mind you. Those were for nobles. Peasants had village justice, which mostly meant whatever the lords said was law. If you had a conflict with a neighbour, say over land, or a wandering cow, or stolen firewood, you couldn't simply plead your case. You had to petition the manor, pay a fee to be heard, and if your opponent had better offerings, or a friend in the kitchen staff, good luck. Luca once watched his cousin be fined for theft because a neighbour accused him of suspicious walking. That was it. No proof, no witnesses. Just a man's word and a suspicious gait. And when the cousin couldn't pay, the steward took his last goat. And this was all considered normal. Expected. Fair even by the standards of the people at the top. They called it custom. They said it was tradition. And in a way, it was. But that didn't make it just. It just made it old. Nature itself seemed to be in on the cruelty. The weather was unpredictable and merciless. A late frost could kill a spring crop overnight. A dry summer meant the wells dried up and the grain shriveled. A hailstorm in August could ruin a year's worth of hope in 5 minutes. And yet, the taxes didn't change. The dues didn't pause. The Boyar's men still came with their scrolls and sacks, expecting the same amounts, regardless of whether anything had actually grown. And if you failed to meet the quota, that was your fault, of course. Never the climate, never poor planning, just laziness. That favourite noble diagnosis. If a field failed too many years in a row, you'd be moved, shifted like livestock to another part of the manor to try your hand there. Which meant starting from scratch on worse soil with worse tools, all while being shamed for not producing miracles. And the clergy? They offered prayers. Occasionally, they blamed it on sin. Marika once recalled a sermon where the priest said a hailstorm was punishment for the village's lack of piety. She'd laughed under her breath, and Luca had immediately shushed her. Because blasphemy wasn't just a spiritual offence, it was a social death sentence. It was hard to pinpoint what stung more, the injustice or the fact that no one expected anything better. The system had worked so thoroughly, so completely, that even imagining an alternative felt dangerous, radical, wrong. The villagers didn't call it oppression. They called it the way things are. And that, in many ways, was the final chain. You couldn't revolt against gravity. You couldn't rebel against the wind. That's how feudalism was treated. An immovable, natural fact of life. As if it had always been there. As if it always would be. Still, even within this tightly wound noose, people found tiny ways to breathe. Luca would sometimes trade bread for honey with a man from the next village. Technically illegal. Entirely necessary. Marika knew a woman who stitched wool under the table and passed it to a peddler for spices. Also illegal. Also survival. These acts weren't resistance. Not really. They were lifelines. Quiet declarations that said, "We're still here. You haven't erased us completely." And that mattered. Because when everything else was claimed, your land, your labour, your choices, these small secrets, these little smuggled goods, these stolen smiles in the dark, they were yours. Untaxed. Unpunished. At least until someone noticed. Luca kept a hidden pouch behind a loose board in the hut. Inside, a bit of dried fruit, a copper coin, and a carving he'd made for his youngest daughter. Simple, rough, shaped like a bird. He didn't know why he kept it. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was proof that something in his life hadn't been taken yet. because in a world that told him, over and over, that he was born to serve, born to suffer, born to disappear, this little pouch said otherwise. It said, I was here. Chapter 5. Pagan Roots, Christian Chains, Spiritual Confusion. The first thing to understand about religion in medieval Eastern Europe is that it wasn't something you chose. It was something that happened to you. Like weather or taxes. It shaped every corner of your life, but not always in the way you might think. For peasants like Luca, faith wasn't about sacred texts or quiet contemplation. It was about fear, ritual, and trying desperately not to anger anyone, divine or otherwise. He had grown up with stories older than the church itself. His grandmother, a leathery woman with bark-stained fingers and moss between her teeth, used to whisper tales of the forest spirits. She'd light candles on the windowsill during storms to keep the domovoi happy, the little house spirit who watched over the family. On certain nights, she'd bury bread near the tree line for the leshy, the old green man who guarded the woods. It was less belief and more survival. You gave a bit of your food to the forest, and in return, maybe it didn't eat you. But those customs were fading, or more accurately, being pushed out. The Orthodox Church had made its way to their village years ago, carried in on the robes of wandering priests and reinforced by the manor lord, who insisted that proper Christians were more obedient workers. These days, Marika lit candles, not for forest spirits, but the 4 stiff icons of saints she couldn't name. Their children learned prayers in a language no one spoke. Church Slavonic, a distant cousin to their local dialect, but just far enough removed to feel like foreign speech dressed in holy gold. And still, the old habits lingered. Because religion in the village wasn't clean, it wasn't pure, it was messy, conflicted, tense. Luca went to church because the Boyar expected it. He crossed himself out of reflex. But deep down, when the harvest failed or a cow miscarried, he still blamed the forest. Or the stars. Or some forgotten spirit his grandmother once named under her breath. The church didn't approve. Priests called it superstition, sinful, dangerous. Mixing pagan rites with Christian devotion was like pouring mud into wine, they said. But what did they expect? The people had lived by these stories for generations. You don't just rip out a belief system by planting a cross in the square and expecting everyone to fall in line. You had to pry it out, slowly, painfully. And even then, it left behind splinters. Take holy days, for example. On the surface, the villagers celebrated the same calendar as everyone else. Easter, Christmas, Saints' Days. But dig a little deeper, and you'd find they were often just old seasonal festivals with new clothes. Spring planting was once honoured with songs to Mokosh, the Earth Mother. Now it was blessing the fields, with St. Paraskeva's name attached. Winter's darkest day had once been a feast for the sun god Dajbog. Now, the Nativity. The priests knew. Of course they knew. But they tolerated it just enough. As long as the people showed up to Mass, confessed their sins, and paid their dues, they looked the other way when someone tucked herbs under a baby's crib to ward off bad spirits. But if things went too far, if someone tried to heal the sick with charms, or refused confession, or muttered the wrong words over a grave, then the church stepped in. Hard. There were public shaming rituals. A woman caught mixing old rituals with her prayers might be forced to stand barefoot outside the church for hours, holding a stone as penance. Men who spoke against the priest risked fines, or worse, accusations of heresy. And heresy, in a world this rigid, was more dangerous than disease. Still, fear couldn't erase belief. Marika once kept a woven doll in a hidden corner of the hut. It wasn't a saint. It didn't even have a name. It was just protection. Passed down from her mother. She would touch its frayed head gently whenever lightning cracked too close to the roof. She never told the priest. Luca never asked. Some things were better left unspoken. The irony of it all was that the church didn't provide much in the way of comfort. Sure, they offered sacraments, blessings, the occasional sermon about sin and eternal fire. But when Luca's eldest got sick with the coughing fever, the priest didn't come. Said he was too busy. said the child had probably sinned. The boy died within the week. Luca buried him by the river without proper rites. Couldn't afford them. He wept, and not once did he feel closer to God. It was a faith built on obedience, not grace. You didn't pray because you loved the divine. You prayed because you feared what might happen if you didn't. Lightning, wolves, famine, miscarriage. You tithed because the steward watched. You confessed because the priest asked. You knelt because standing too tall was dangerous. Even the churches themselves weren't welcoming. Cold stone walls, smoke-choked air. The icons stared down with unblinking eyes, painted by hands that had never seen a hungry winter. Luca always felt small inside, not humble small, like he didn't belong. Like the faith belonged to someone else, and he was just borrowing it under supervision. Sometimes he wondered, did the Boyar feel the same in church? When he kissed the cross, did he also taste dust? Or did God only show up for people who wore fur coats and owned books? And yet, despite all this confusion, Luca still lit candles, still whispered prayers, still pressed his forehead to old wood and asked for rain, for health, for a break. Maybe because belief wasn't about logic, maybe it was about desperation. When the sky cracked open and hail smashed his barley crop, what else could he do? He couldn't yell at the Boyar, couldn't strike the steward, couldn't undo the weather, but he could pray, even if no one was listening. In that way, religion became less of a ladder to heaven and more of a release valve, somewhere to pour the pain when there was nowhere else to put it. The first thing to understand about religion in medieval Eastern Europe is that it wasn't something you chose. It was something that happened to you, like weather or taxes. It shaped every corner of your life, but not always in the way you might think. For peasants like Luca, faith wasn't about sacred texts or quiet contemplation. It was about fear, ritual, and trying desperately not to anger anyone, divine or otherwise. He had grown up with stories older than the church itself. His grandmother, a leathery woman with bark-stained fingers and moss between her teeth, used to whisper tales of the forest spirits. She'd light candles on the windowsill during storms to keep the domovoi happy, the little house spirit who watched over the family. On certain nights she'd bury bread near the tree line for the leshy, the old green man who guarded the woods. It was less belief and more survival. You gave a bit of your food to the forest, and in return, maybe it didn't eat you. But those customs were fading, or more accurately, being pushed out. The Orthodox Church had made its way to their village years ago, carried in on the robes of wandering priests and reinforced by the manor lord, who insisted that proper Christians were more obedient workers. These days, Marika lit candles, not for forest spirits, but before stiff icons of saints she couldn't name. Their children learned prayers in a language no one spoke. Church Slavonic. A distant cousin to their local dialect, but just far enough removed to feel like foreign speech dressed in holy gold. And still the old habits lingered. Because religion in the village wasn't clean, it wasn't pure, it was messy, conflicted, tense. Luca went to church because the Boyar expected it. He crossed himself out of reflex. But deep down, when the harvest failed or a cow miscarried, he still blamed the forest, or the stars, or some forgotten spirit his grandmother once named under her breath. The church didn't approve. Priests called it superstition, sinful, dangerous. Mixing pagan rites with Christian devotion was like pouring mud into wine, they said. But what did they expect? The people had lived by these stories for generations. You don't just rip out a belief system by planting a cross in the square and expecting everyone to fall in line. You had to pry it out, slowly, painfully. And even then, it left behind splinters. Take holy days, for example. On the surface, the villagers celebrated the same calendar as everyone else, Easter, Christmas, Saints' days. But dig a little deeper, and you'd find they were often just old seasonal festivals with new clothes. Spring planting was once honoured with songs to Mokosh, the Earth Mother. Now it was blessing the fields, with St. Paraskiva's name attached. Winter's darkest day had once been a feast for the sun god Dashbog. Now The nativity. The priests knew. Of course they knew. But they tolerated it just enough. As long as the people showed up to Mass, confessed their sins, and paid their dues, they looked the other way when someone tucked herbs under a baby's crib to ward off bad spirits. But if things went too far, if someone tried to heal the sick with charms, or refused confession, or muttered the wrong words over a grave, then the church stepped in. Hard. There were public shaming rituals. A woman caught mixing old rituals with her prayers might be forced to stand barefoot outside the church for hours, holding a stone as penance. Men who spoke against the priest risked fines, or worse, accusations of heresy. And heresy, in a world this rigid, was more dangerous than disease. Still, fear couldn't erase belief. Marika once kept a woven doll in a hidden corner of the hut. It wasn't a saint, it didn't even have a name, it was just protection, passed down from her mother. She would touch its frayed head gently whenever lightning cracked too close to the roof. She never told the priest. Luca never asked. Some things were better left unspoken. The irony of it all was that the church didn't provide much in the way of comfort. Sure, they offered sacraments, blessings, the occasional sermon about sin and eternal fire. But when Luca's eldest got sick with the coughing fever, the priest didn't come. Said he was too busy. Said the child had probably sinned. The boy died within the week. Luca buried him by the river without proper rites. Couldn't afford them. He wept. And not once did he feel closer to God. It was a faith built on obedience, not grace. You didn't pray because you loved the divine. You prayed because you feared what might happen if you didn't. Lightning, wolves, famine, miscarriage. You tithed because the steward watched. You confessed because the priest asked. You knelt because standing too tall was dangerous. Even the churches themselves weren't welcoming. Cold stone walls, smoke-choked air. The icons stared down with unblinking eyes, painted by hands that had never seen a hungry winter. Luca always felt small inside, not humble small, like he didn't belong. Like the faith belonged to someone else, and he was just borrowing it under supervision. Sometimes he wondered, did the Boyar feel the same in church? When he kissed the cross, did he also taste dust? Or did God only show up for people who wore fur coats and owned books? And yet, despite all this confusion, Lucas still lit candles, still whispered prayers, still pressed his forehead to old wood and asked for rain, for health, for a break. Maybe because belief wasn't about logic, maybe it was about desperation. When the sky cracked open and hail smashed his barley crop, what else could he do? He couldn't yell at the Boyar, couldn't strike the steward, couldn't undo the weather. But he could pray, even if no one was listening. In that way, religion became less of a ladder to heaven and more of a release valve, somewhere to pour the pain when there was nowhere else to put it. Chapter 6. When War Came to the Fields, Raids and Conquests. In the quiet parts of the countryside, where the fog settled low and the trees never quite lost their shadows, peace was never really trusted. It wasn't that the peasants expected happiness. Happiness was a rumour from another world. But stillness, that uneasy silence between storms, always made Luca nervous. It meant something was coming, and often it was war. Not declared war like you read about in noble records or hear sung by travelling bards. Not banners clashing or generals shouting orders from polished saddles. No, the wars that touched Luca's village didn't come with trumpets or speeches. They came in the form of fire, of hooves thundering through crops, of strangers speaking languages no one understood, shouting and stabbing before anyone even had time to pray. War, to a peasant, wasn't politics. It was panic. One moment you were grinding barley for soup. The next, someone was kicking down your door and dragging your cousin into the dirt. It wasn't always clear who the invaders were. Sometimes they were Tartars from the steppe, lightning quick and merciless, their arrows darkening the sky before you even spotted them on the ridge. Sometimes they were Polish soldiers, or Hungarian raiders, or mercenaries whose pay had dried up and who figured they'd take what they wanted from the defenceless. Once it was soldiers from the king's own army, allegedly sent to protect the region, but more interested in collecting provisions. Luca still remembered that phrase, collecting provisions. As if smashing open your food stores and stealing your only pig was some sort of bureaucratic task. There was no safe side, no alliances that spared the poor. Whoever passed through, no matter whose flag they waved, took what they wanted. The Boyars had towers and stone walls. The peasants had fences, made of sticks. When the attacks came, they came fast. No warnings, just screams. The men tried to hide the animals, sometimes bury the grain under floorboards. The women grabbed the children and fled into the woods, hoping the trees would hide them, or at least slow down the horses. But even the forest had limits. A child crying in the dark was a beacon. A snapped twig could cost a life. Luca had once run barefoot into the marsh with his wife and son in the dead of night, carrying nothing but a waterskin and the clothes on his back. They hid beneath low shrubs, while fires flickered on the horizon. Roofs burning, animals shrieking, men shouting. He held his hand over his son's mouth as the boy whimpered, not in fear, but confusion. The child didn't understand what was happening. How could he? 1 hour earlier, they were feeding chickens. When they returned the next morning, what was left barely qualified as a village. Huts torched, doors hacked off their hinges, the millstone shattered. 2 of the elders were missing, presumed dead. A neighbour's daughter had been found by the well, her hair ripped out in clumps, her eyes open but no longer seeing. There was no justice, no retribution. The Boyar, safely nestled in his manor 2 days' ride away, sent a note expressing concern. The priest said it was God's punishment for forgotten prayers, and life, somehow, was expected to resume. But that's the horror of peasant life during war. You had no say in any of it, yet you suffered all of it. You didn't decide who fought whom. You didn't know what sparked the latest feud. But you paid the price. In firewood, in livestock, in blood, and the scars ran deep. Trust, once frayed, rarely mended. The village stopped gathering at dusk. Doors were barred early. Stories about shadowy soldiers and wolf-headed spirits became common around the fire. Marika would sleep with a knife tucked into her skirt folds, though neither she nor Luca believed it would do much good. Worse still was the aftermath. War didn't just take, it left things behind. Empty fields, sickness, hunger, fear, soldiers' lice, broken tools, smoke, damaged lungs, and people who were never quite whole again. The butcher stopped speaking. A boy who once sang to the sheep now rocked back and forth, counting the sky. These weren't casualties per se, but they were losses all the same. Then came the taxes, because of course they did. As soon as the fires cooled, the Boyar's men returned, demanding quotas, insisting the village catch up on what was owed, as if wheat grew overnight, as if you could rebuild a granary with burnt wood. They didn't bring aid, they brought ledgers, they brought whips. One of the cruelest lies in medieval Europe was the idea of protection, that the nobles kept the peace, that they earned their privileges by defending the weak. But in truth they hid behind stone far from the smoke and only emerged to collect. And yet they taught the peasants to thank them for it. That's what Luca couldn't stomach. Not the violence, he'd grown numb to that, but the performance of justice. The idea that anyone up the ladder actually cared. He'd seen men die defending their fields. He'd seen women scar their own faces to avoid being taken by invaders. He'd seen fathers sell their tools for a handful of dried grain to keep their children from starving. And none of it mattered. History books might remember kings and conquests, dates, borders redrawn with quills and wax seals. But no parchment ever recorded Luca's village burning. No scholar ever listed the names of the children who died hiding in root cellars. Their war didn't make it into the songs, but it happened. Again, and again, and still life moved on. It had to. You swept up the ashes. You rebuilt the roof with scavenged timber. You stitched wounds and buried the dead and prayed, not for peace, because no one believed in that anymore, but for the next storm to come a little later, to give you time to grow something, to catch your breath. Luca once whispered to Marika during one of those nights when the forest felt too quiet, I think the next one will be worse." She didn't argue, she just held his hand, because she knew. It wasn't the fire that haunted them most, not the smoke, not even the bodies. It was what came after. The silence. The stillness that returned to the village like a ghost, too full of guilt to rest. There were no trumpets to signal that it was over, no treaties, just absence. Absence of people, of animals, of colour. The land went grey, the air got quiet, and everyone started pretending again. They patched roofs, they shared seeds, they bartered with sadness instead of coin. But nothing felt real, not for a long time. Luca had always known war was a threat. Everyone did. But no one truly understood how it reshaped a soul until it crawled into your home and sat at your table. It changed people, not like a sharp knife, more like a grinding stone. Slowly, quietly, shaving away the parts that believed in fairness, or kindness, or rest. It wasn't just the men who bore scars. The women, especially the women, carried burdens that never healed. After the last raid, Marika had found her neighbour's daughter under the collapsed woodshed, alive but not speaking. Just sitting, rocking, eyes wide like the world had broken, and she was still looking at the shards. No one asked her what had happened. No one needed to. They already knew. That was how you dealt with these things. You didn't talk. You worked. And yet, the trauma oozed into everything. Meals became quieter. Songs disappeared. Children stopped playing loudly. The laughter that once slipped through the village like sunlight now felt dangerous, like a sound that might bring attention, and attention brought death. The seasons didn't wait for grief. Spring came, and with it, planting. The villagers limped through the motions, digging furrows in fields still charred from torches, scattering seeds with hands that had buried too much. The ground didn't care. It received everything the same: life, death, ash, rain. Then came the scavengers. Not wolves, though they too had returned. No, these were human. Soldiers gone rogue. Bandits in stolen uniforms. Survivors from some other ruined village who now lived by theft because they knew no other way. They came quietly, often in the early dawn, when the light hadn't yet reached the tree line. They didn't torch homes. They took food. Tools. Sometimes girls. And there was no one to stop them. The Boyar's men came only to demand tribute, not to protect. The priest offered prayers, of course, but he did so from behind a locked door. He reminded the village that all suffering was temporary, that heaven rewarded endurance. But endurance didn't patch broken ribs. It didn't fill empty stomachs. Luca had considered taking his family and leaving, running to a larger town, starting over. But how do you start over when you have nothing? No coin, no animals, no weapons. And besides, where would they go? Every road held the same dangers. Every village had its own pain. And in the towns, peasants like Luca were treated like pests, unwanted labourers who brought lice and sadness with them. So they stayed. And life resumed, not because it healed, but because survival doesn't ask for permission. You just do the next thing. You grind flour. You mend the fence. You bury the weak. You plant more rye. Sometimes Luca would sit by the well at sunset and stare into the woods. He wasn't looking for anything. Just listening. The crack of a branch. The call of a bird. The wind. Each sound became a signal. Was it safe? Was it time to run? This hyper-awareness seeped into every corner of life. Marika flinched at loud footsteps. The children no longer ran barefoot into the meadows. Even laughter was rationed, like a luxury, because peace, when it did come, felt rented, like a guest that would be asked to leave at any moment. Worse still were the stories. Survivors from other villages brought them quietly, over shared bowls of soup. Stories of burned churches, of priests impaled on spears, of entire hamlets banished overnight with only crows left behind. Luca listened. He didn't doubt them. He didn't need to. His own nightmares were proof enough. But perhaps the deepest wound was the sense of betrayal, not just from raiders or soldiers, but from the system itself. the nobles who called themselves protectors but did nothing, the church, which preached mercy but delivered silence, the kings whose wars stirred the soil and left peasants to eat the dirt. It was an unspoken truth that everyone knew. The people in power didn't care. Not really. They saw peasants as fuel wood to be burned in the engines of war, food to keep the economy alive. Names weren't remembered, losses weren't counted. Your death only mattered if it left a field unharvested. Still, Luca clung to the ritual of normalcy. He taught his son how to tie bundles of wheat, showed his daughter how to weave, told stories by the fire, not happy ones, but ones that explained why the moon changed shape or why geese fly south. He didn't know if he believed the stories anymore, but they filled the silence. And that, perhaps, was the only real weapon they had left, memory. The ability to remember what had been lost, to whisper it, even in secret, to hand it down so the forgetting wouldn't win. Because if they forgot, if they stopped telling the truth of what happened, then the wounds would fester into myth. And myth was the thing nobles used to justify the next round of violence. One evening, as he sat mending a broken rake, Luca turned to Marika and said quietly, "They'll come again. Maybe not this year, but they will." She didn't flinch, she just nodded. Then she passed him the twine. Because when war lives in your bones, you don't wait for it, you prepare. Chapter 7. Famines, Frost, and Failing Crops. There was hunger, and then there was famine. Luca had known hunger all his life. The kind that made your belly ache through the night, that twisted your insides and left you chewing slowly, hoping it might trick your stomach into thinking more was coming. But famine, that was something else. It didn't just empty your belly, it hollowed out the world. It began slowly, almost unnoticeably. A few stalks of wheat didn't grow. A patch of barley turned yellow too soon. The summer was dry, and the wind felt wrong, too hot, too early. Then came the hail. It hit fast, violent. Smashed the few remaining crops into pulp. You'd think stone had fallen from the sky. Birds stopped singing. Even the rats looked thin. Luca knew the signs. The villagers did too. They stopped greeting each other. Conversations died. People walked hunched, as if they could shrink their stomachs with posture alone. The stew pots grew quieter. More water, less meat. Then no meat, then roots, then boiled grass, then nothing. You'd think by now they'd have learned to prepare, store grain, preserve meat. But preparation was a luxury. When every harvest barely fed you until spring, what was there to save? And it wasn't just the weather. The soil itself had turned against them. Years of overuse, no rest, no rotation. They planted what they could, where they could, over and over until the land gave up. No fertilizer, no knowledge of fallowing, just desperation stabbing at dirt. Then came the animals. First the cows, too weak to stand, then the pigs, then the chickens, plucked bare and eaten before they laid their next egg. By winter, the only sound in most pens was the wind. Marika tried to stretch what they had. She soaked stale bread until it turned into paste. She boiled bark. She picked bitter berries no one usually touched. She mixed dried moss with cabbage. The children cried for more, even when their bowls were empty. At night, Luca would lie awake and listen to their breathing, slowed, shallow, weak. One son's ribs stuck out like the rafters of the collapsing roof. The baby's skin hung like fabric from her bones, and there was nothing he could do, not a damn thing. They tried the priest. He had reserves, surely, but Father Miklos offered only a sermon and a blessing. "Suffering purifies the soul," he said, not meeting Marika's eyes. "The Lord provides." But the Lord hadn't delivered bread, just frost. And the Boyar, he still demanded his share. That was the true cruelty of the famine. Even when there was nothing, the quotas stayed the same. The steward rode into town with his scroll, looked at the dying oxen, the limp grain sacks, the eyes of starving children, and still took what he was owed. "For the manna," he said, "the Lord's table must not go empty." Because of course it couldn't. That would be injustice. Luca watched as the last of their rye was loaded onto the cart. His hands shook, not from rage, but from weakness. If he'd had strength, he might have tried something. But famine didn't leave room for rebellion. It starved the fire right out of you. People began to disappear. Old men went into the woods and didn't return. Mothers wrapped themselves in blankets and stopped moving. Children were buried at sunrise before the ground froze again. No ceremonies, no markers, just names whispered into the dirt. Then came the rumours. Cannibalism. No one said it out loud, not directly. But they told stories about distant villages, about desperate parents, about children who vanished with no graves. Luca didn't want to believe it. But when hunger claws at your mind, when your child cries for days without a drop of milk, belief doesn't matter anymore. He caught Marika staring at the dog once, her eyes distant, unreadable. He said nothing, because deep down he understood. And that terrified him more than anything. They burned furniture, tore down the shed for firewood, wore scraps upon scraps stitched with string. But still the cold came in, still the wind screamed through the broken walls. And still, somehow, the steward returned in January, this time for wool, from animals that no longer existed. Luca offered rags instead. The steward laughed. "Then work it off," he said, and left. A week later, Luca was pulling stones from the road for repairs on the Boyar's hunting trail. His hands bled. His son had a fever. No one cared. And what did the history books say about that year, that region, that stretch of suffering? Nothing. A line, maybe. Crop failure in rural eastern provinces. A statistic. A number on a page. But to Luca, it was the year his youngest died. The year his wife stopped humming while she worked. The year the village well froze so solid they had to crack it with axes. The year he dug a grave with his bare hands because the shovel had been sold for salt. And through it all, the world moved on. The church rang its bells. The nobles feasted. The merchants talked of grain prices in cities Luca would never see. His suffering, like the field he tended, was invisible to them. Just another part of the landscape. And yet, he got up each day, hauled water, fed the child that remained, sat by Marika as she stitched together yet another rag to cover yet another hole, because there was no other option. You didn't survive famine with strength. You survived it with emptiness, with the absence of hope, with the dull, cold stubbornness that said, "I will not die today." And that was enough. For now. By the time spring crept in, it wasn't greeted with joy. It was met with suspicion. Luca stepped outside on the first thawed morning, not with hope, but with dread. He scanned the sky, watched the trees, felt the breeze with the weariness of someone who'd been lied to before. Because in years like these, spring didn't promise rebirth. It just whispered, "Let's try this again." The snow melted to reveal death, not metaphor, actual bodies. A fox curled near the chapel wall, jaw open in mid-snarl. A man Luca didn't recognize frozen beside a pile of firewood he'd never lit. A baby's bundle, half buried beneath the slush, small enough to be missed unless you were looking. Luca turned away. He didn't have the strength to dig another grave. And the graves, there were too many of them now. The village's tiny burial ground had long since filled. New mounds rose in the woods, shallow, rushed. No markers, no prayers, just earth and silence. Sometimes they buried 2 or 3 together. Sometimes they didn't bury them at all, just covered them with brush and left them to the crows. Even the priest had stopped doing funerals. Not because he was too busy, because he was too frightened. He said the souls of the unblessed dead were beginning to gather near the edge of the forest. "Restless," he whispered to Marika one day, eyes twitching. "They knock at my door at night." Whether he meant it literally or not, no one asked. But the church bells stopped ringing after that. People adapted in strange ways. They had to. When survival becomes the only rule, all others dissolve. Luca saw things he never thought possible. A woman feeding her children a broth made from her own leather shoes. A man stealing grain from the chapel, then returning the next day to confess. Another man didn't confess. He was found 3 days later in the stream, stones in his pockets. No one asked why. They already knew. The hunger twisted people, not just their bodies, but their minds. Faces became sharper, eyes more hollow, Kindness faded, then returned in short bursts. A woman shared her last onion with a neighbour. A boy gave his gloves to his sister. These gestures became sacred small sparks in a landscape gone dim. Luca tried to keep some structure. He woke at dawn even when there was nothing to do. He cleared the ashes from the hearth. He told stories to the children. Anything to make the silence less loud. He taught his daughter to weave with grass. It wouldn't clothe her, but it kept her hands moving. And sometimes that was all you needed, movement. Marika changed too. Her hands became even more silent, her voice thinner, like it had forgotten how to rise above a whisper. She still prayed, but quietly, her lips barely moving. She didn't go to the chapel anymore. Said God could hear her just fine from home. The worst part, though, wasn't the cold, or the hunger, or even the death. It was the realization that no one was coming. There would be no cart of food from the manor, no gesture of mercy from the steward, no miracle from the sky. This wasn't a temporary tragedy, it was normal. The system was functioning exactly as designed. The Boyar got what he wanted, the priests stayed fed, and the peasants fed the dirt. This revelation didn't spark revolution, it sparked numbness, a collective shrug. If the world was built to bury you, you stopped pretending to stand tall. You just made yourself easier to bury. And yet, despite all that, something strange remained. Luca still noticed the warmth of the sun on his neck when he stepped into the field. Marika still smiled, just barely, when the baby said her first word. The villagers still lit candles at the edge of their fields when planting season came, not because they thought it would help, but because it was what they'd always done. Tradition, after all, was the only thing they owned. It was a memory, a ritual, a rebellion, a way of saying, I may starve, I may break, but I remember who I am. When planting finally began, it was with broken tools and shallow hope. The seed stores were low, the oxen were fewer. The hands doing the work were older, thinner, more brittle than ever. But they planted anyway, not because they believed in abundance, but because they couldn't not plant. To do nothing would be to admit defeat, and peasants, though crushed, bent, bled dry, rarely admitted defeat. That was the one thing the lords and priests never quite understood. You could steal their food, take their children, burn their homes, but they'd still wake up the next day and scratch at the earth like it owed them something. Because maybe it did. Luca pressed his fingers into the dirt, feeling the cold soil, softer now but still resistant. He dropped a seed, covered it, moved to the next spot. Repeat. He didn't say a prayer, not anymore. But Marika, watching from the edge of the field, quietly did. Chapter 8, Plague and Pestilence. No doctors, no hope. Chapter 8, Plague and Pestilence. No doctors, no hope. If hunger hollowed the village, disease finished the job. It didn't announce itself with drama. No thunderclaps, no omens, just a cough. Someone's child wheezing in the corner of a smoke-choked hut. A man wiping sweat from his brow in the middle of a cold morning. A woman who suddenly couldn't stand without trembling. Then, within days, it would spread quietly, efficiently, like a shadow slipping through the thatch roof. And before anyone even named it, people started digging more graves. Luca had learned to recognize the signs before the priest did. First, the chickens would stop clucking. Then the dogs stopped barking. Then the neighbours stopped talking. A kind of hush fell over the village, like everyone had agreed not to disturb death while it worked. The symptoms changed every time. Fevers, swellings, strange-coloured tongues, skin turning black at the edges. But the outcome rarely did. You either got better fast, or you didn't get better at all. Of course, there were no doctors, not in a place like this. The closest thing to medicine was herbal lore passed from mother to daughter, or the priest's catch-all solution, more prayer. Sometimes, an old widow would be known for her knowledge of roots and tinctures. Marika had gone to one once, desperate to cure their daughter's fever. The woman gave her dry yarrow and whispered a few words in an old tongue. The child survived, but the priest called it witchcraft when he found out. He made Marika confess in front of the entire chapel and threatened to burn the old woman's hut if it happened again. So the villagers stopped speaking to her. She died that winter, alone. The irony, of course, was that the priest himself didn't have answers either. He handed out holy water like it was wine, told everyone to fast to cleanse their souls. But he never visited the sick, never touched the bodies. Spiritual guidance, he said, not healing. And the Boyar? He simply barred the manor gates. His household remained untouched. They claimed it was divine favour. Everyone else suspected it had more to do with clean water and imported soap. Soap. Now there was a fantasy. Luca had once heard of people in distant cities using olive oil to wash their hair. He couldn't fathom it. In the village, washing meant jumping into a freezing stream once a month, maybe rubbing down with lard and ashes if you could afford to waste them. Hygiene wasn't neglected. It was impossible. That's what made the disease so vicious. It didn't just kill, it humiliated. It bloated bodies, turned skin strange colours, caused people to moan, hallucinate, soil themselves in public. By the time it ran its course, the sick weren't even recognisable. They became something else, creatures to be feared, pitied, avoided. And when they died, they were buried fast, often in the same clothes they'd fallen ill in, often in shallow pits dug in the dark. Luca dug more graves that year than he had in all the years prior. He stopped saying names. He stopped carving markers. There were too many. And what was the point? No one came to mourn. Mourning had become another luxury, like meat or dry boots. People tried to fight back, of course, not with medicine, there wasn't any, but with ritual. They lit candles, burned incense, rubbed garlic on door frames, hung holy icons upside down. One man even nailed a dead bird above his doorway, claiming it would confuse the spirits. The priest was furious. The man was dead within a week. There were darker moments too. Whispers that someone had brought the sickness, that it wasn't random, that it was punishment for hidden sins, for pagan practices, for someone's secret heresy. Old grudges bubbled up. A widow was accused of cursing her neighbour's field. A young boy was blamed for looking at a sick ox the wrong way. In times of peace, these accusations would have been laughable. In plague time, they led to exile or worse. And still, life went on. Because it had to. Luca watched his neighbours disappear one by one. People he'd known since childhood. Men he'd ploughed fields beside. Women who had helped birth his children. Gone. No ceremony, no goodbye. Just an empty seat at the fire. Marika refused to let him say the word plague. She said it gave it power. So they called it the fog, like naming it something softer might dull its bite. But it didn't. Their youngest took sick in the middle of summer. A fever, sudden and sharp, no warning, no time. They tried everything, cold cloths, elderflower tea, prayer. Luca even dug a grave early, just in case, and hated himself for it. But she recovered. Somehow. Slowly. Like the sickness had changed its mind. They celebrated with a crust of bread and an extra candle at the shrine. It was the closest thing to a miracle they'd ever seen. But many others weren't so lucky. The church bell stopped ringing after a while. Too many deaths. Too few people left to ring it. The priest said he was fasting for the sins of the village. In truth, he was hiding. Everyone knew it. But no one said a word. Let the man hide. Let the man hide. That was the village's unofficial decision. If the priest wanted to lock himself behind thick oak doors and mutter Latin no one understood, let him. At least he wasn't spreading the sickness. And in a time where the only choices were suffering or silence, silence felt like mercy. But not everyone was so fortunate. In a village already stripped raw by hunger, the plague arrived like a final blow from a cruel god. It didn't just take the old or the weak, it took the young, the strong, the ones who had survived all the other things. Luca watched a man who had lifted boulders for roadwork die within 2 days of a cough. His skin turned grey, his lips cracked. His eyes bulged like they were trying to escape before the rest of him shut down. And then he was gone. Marika began boiling everything. Water, rags, even clothes. Anything that had touched someone sick. She burned dried herbs in corners of the hut. She tied garlic and onion skins above the doorway. The priest might have called it superstition, but no one argued anymore. The old rules were dead. Only instinct remained. One morning, Luca found a bundle of dead mice outside their door. He didn't know who left them or why. He didn't ask. He just swept them into a ditch and burned them. Another day, a goat was found with its legs tied, its eyes gouged out. Someone said it was to confuse the spirits. Others said it was just madness. Either way, no one claimed it. People were unraveling, not just physically but mentally. The fear was a second illness, one that spread faster than the fever ever did. Doors stayed shut even during daylight. Children stopped playing altogether. You could walk through the entire village and hear nothing but wind and coughing. Occasionally someone would scream, then it would be quiet again, and in the quiet, suspicion grew. Luca had always known fear of hunger, of taxes, of punishment. But this was different. This fear had no name, no face. It couldn't be bribed or reasoned with. You couldn't dig it out of the field or hide from it in the woods. It followed you, crept into your hut at night, settled in your chest like a stone. He started checking Marika's breath at night, watching her chest rise and fall, holding his own breath when hers paused too long. She did the same. Neither of them spoke of it. They didn't have to. Love, in a time like this, wasn't spoken. It was shown. In silence. In glances. In shared bowls and tightened hands. And still, they worked. Because if you stopped moving, the sickness won. So Luca dragged himself to the field each morning, even when there was nothing left to harvest. He patched fences. He scraped frost from the roof. He checked traps, even though no animal had been caught in weeks. He needed the rhythm, needed to pretend that life still required things of him. The Boyar, of course, was fine. Rumours drifted down from the manor. Of fresh meat, of imported wine, of doctors with clean hands and perfumed cloaks. Some even said he'd built a second wall around his dining room to preserve the air. Luca didn't know if it was true, but it felt true, and that was enough to make it hurt. The steward came only once that month. He stood at the edge of the village, nose wrapped in cloth, and shouted that Jews were still expected. Sickness or no, he barked, the manor must be fed. Then he turned and rode away. Not a word of sympathy, not even a false prayer. It was around that time that the first woman walked into the forest and didn't return. She didn't bring supplies, didn't take her child, just walked. Straight into the trees. Her name was Daria. She had lost 2 sons the week before. Some said she went looking for the forest spirits her grandmother once prayed to. Others said she simply gave herself up. Luca thought it was both. By midsummer, nearly a third of the village was gone, and those who remained looked empty. They moved through routines, but their eyes were far away. Marika stopped singing. Luca stopped carving. The baby stopped babbling. Life became a series of repetitions. Wake, work, boil, sleep, pray. Wake again. It was less living, more echoing. But even echoes fade. Then, one day, the coughing stopped. Not because the sickness had vanished, but because it had no one left to infect. That silence, at first, felt like a victory. Luca and Marika sat outside the hut, watching the sky turn orange over the ruined field, and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The plague hadn't ended. It had simply finished its task, and what it left behind was a village that no longer recognized itself. Gone were the little routines, the shared bread, the gossip, the laughter. In its place, space. Empty chairs, empty beds, empty homes, entire families erased like chalk in the rain. But still, the crops needed planting, the roof needed fixing, the baby needed holding. So, Luca stood. He tied a strip of old cloth around his wrist and stepped into the field, not as a celebration, not even as survival, but as defiance. Because death had come for everything, and he had nothing left to give. Chapter 9. The Lord's Law. No justice for the poor Luca had never seen the inside of a court, not a real one. Those were for nobles and city folk, the kind with stone halls and men in cloaks who spoke in Latin and scratched notes with feathered pens. For peasants like Luca, justice came in the form of a man on horseback with a whip on one hip and a scroll on the other. If you were lucky, it was just a scroll. The law didn't live in the village. It rode in. When a dispute happened, say one neighbour accused another of stealing chickens, or someone's fence collapsed onto someone else's field, it wasn't resolved with discussion or negotiation. It was handled by the steward. And the steward's idea of law was simple: side with the man who offered more grain. There was no fairness, no presumption of innocence, just hierarchy. If you were poor, dirty, and sunburned from years in the fields, you were guilty before you opened your mouth. If you tried to defend yourself too passionately, that was seen as insolence. And insolence had its own punishment. Luca once watched his cousin Dava stand accused of stealing a bushel of oats. The accusation came from a man who owned slightly more land, a slightly newer plough, and a brother who worked in the manor's stables. Dava swore he was innocent. Swore he'd been with his children the entire evening. The steward didn't care. He fined him 2 goats. Goats Dava didn't own. When he couldn't pay, the steward took his eldest son for labour duty in the manor kitchens. The boy never came back. And just like that, the matter was resolved. It was an old truth. The law didn't protect peasants. It managed them. There were written codes, of course, rules etched onto parchment and stored in manor halls or cathedrals. But Luca had never seen them. No one in the village had. They couldn't read. They didn't know what they were accused of until they were punished. That was the brilliance of the system. Ignorance was part of the sentence. If a peasant spoke out, they were disrupting order. If they questioned a tithe, they were disrespecting God. If they missed a labour day, they were in breach of feudal duty. The words changed, but the outcome didn't. You paid. You suffered. You obeyed. And punishment wasn't some symbolic gesture. It was pain. Real, public pain. Lashes in the square. Fines that took your last sack of grain. Exile, which might as well have been a death sentence. And if the Lord was feeling particularly inspired, execution. Quick, cold, and final. There was no jury, no trial. Just a nod from a man who ate while you starved. Even the church joined in. Spiritual law carried its own weight. Miss Mass, you owed penance. Speak out during a sermon, you were made to crawl on your knees through the chapel, begging forgiveness. Confess a sin too late, and you might be refused burial rites. A fate worse than death for a soul clinging to its last thread of meaning. Marika once spilled milk on the chapel floor. An accident. Her hands had trembled from hunger, her fingers too numb to grip the clay pot properly. The priest made her fast for 3 days and clean the chapel with rags soaked in cold water. To humble the spirit, he said. It did more than that. It broke something. And the worst part? No one fought back. Not because they agreed, but because resistance meant obliteration. Luca had heard stories from his grandfather about uprisings. Brief, desperate attempts by peasants to demand justice. They always ended the same way. Men hanged from trees. Women locked in barns and burned. Children forced to watch. Then silence. Always silence. And the nobility? They called it restoring order. As if they'd simply rearranged furniture. The Boyar in Luca's region was known to say, "The poor need rules more than roofs." A phrase repeated like scripture in the manor, while peasants patched holes in their walls with animal hides. His own roof was tiled slate. Sometimes a travelling judge would pass through, sent from the city to observe local justice. He'd wear robes, speak in flourished language, ask a few polite questions. Then he'd nod at the steward, dine with the Boyar, and ride away. Nothing ever changed. His visit was a performance, like a play where everyone knew the ending but still clapped. The legal absurdity reached such levels that peasants were taxed for accessing justice, a fee just to be heard. Luca once tried to settle a boundary dispute with his neighbour, whose field line had crept 1/2 metre into his own. He filed a complaint, verbally of course, because paper was for priests, and was told he had to provide 2 chickens for administrative effort. He didn't have 2 chickens. So the neighbour kept the land. The only justice the peasants truly knew was the one they made for themselves. Quiet acts of solidarity. Passing food when the steward wasn't looking. Telling stories about dead children so they wouldn't be forgotten. Sitting beside someone who'd been punished just so they wouldn't be alone. Even vengeance, when it happened, was soft. A cracked wheel on the steward's cart. A rotted fish hidden in the manor's well. Nothing too bold, nothing that could be traced. Just little cracks in the facade. Enough to remind themselves they still existed. Because in a world where the law belonged to the rich, existence itself became resistance. Justice, for the peasants of Eastern Europe, didn't just fail them. It watched them suffer, measured their pain, and then taxed them for the privilege. The laws weren't made to protect the weak. They were tools, sharpened not by fairness but by fear, meant to reinforce the very chains the peasants were born wearing. And those chains cut deeper for some than others. Marika understood this better than most. As a woman, her body was not her own, not in life, not in law. She could be beaten by her husband legally. She could be stripped and humiliated by the church legally. She could be accused of tempting men with unchaste behaviour if she walked alone, or if she spoke too confidently, or if she laughed at the wrong time. And worst of all, she could be blamed for everything that went wrong. If a cow miscarried, the midwife was called. If the rain didn't come, a woman with a crooked back was named. If the bread wouldn't rise, someone whispered, she must have cursed it. And suddenly, it wasn't just gossip. It was law. The steward could fine her. The priest could name her. The village could turn its back. Witchcraft accusations weren't common, but the threat of them was always there. A woman who knew too much about herbs, who healed a wound when the priest's prayers failed, who had no children, or too many, who didn't cry at her husband's funeral. Suspicion was enough. It always was. Luca remembered when it happened to Anita. She had lived alone on the edge of the village. Kind eyes, strong hands. No husband. He'd died in a hunting accident years before. She kept bees, gathered mushrooms, and treated sick children when they had no other hope. Marika had visited her once, desperate for help with a fevered baby. Anita gave her willow bark tea and a blessing. The baby lived. Then, the next winter, the steward's mare died of illness. And Anita was seen walking past the manor gate the same day. That was all it took. The accusation came from a nervous Boyar's cousin visiting from the city. He didn't like the way she looked at him. He said she muttered something. The priest agreed. He'd always thought she was too bold, too proud. They called it maleficium, evil working. She was taken, not to the manor, to the church cellar. No one saw her again. They said she confessed, under questioning. But everyone knew what that meant. The law didn't need evidence. It needed a victim. The church's version of justice was soaked in incense and rot. They framed their cruelty with holy words, corrective penance, moral cleansing. But the reality was simple, control. And fear was their most effective sermon. Women bore the brunt. If a man sinned, he was weak. If a woman sinned, she was dangerous. Lust, pride, stubbornness, female traits to be tamed. Confession was mandatory. Confession without punishment, rare. And punishment wasn't symbolic. It was flesh and blood. Flagellation, fasting to the point of collapse. Shunning, which was just spiritual exile disguised as mercy. And then there was trial by ordeal. It sounded ancient, but it was very much alive. If someone was accused of theft, they might be made to hold a red-hot iron. If their hands blistered, they were guilty. If a woman was suspected of lying, she might be dunked in water. Float, you were guilty. Sink, innocent but possibly dead. Luca once saw a boy no older than 12 accused of stealing bread. He was forced to walk across hot coals. His feet were ruined for life. But the bread was never found. The Boyar praised the trial's success. It revealed God's will. And that was the terrifying truth. The people who enforced these laws believed in them. Not all of them, perhaps, but enough. Enough to keep the system churning, smooth and silent, like a millstone grinding bone into dust. Even the village elders, when consulted, had no real power. They were expected to keep the peace. But peace meant compliance. Peace meant nodding at the steward's decisions. Peace meant staying quiet when a man was dragged from his hut in the middle of the night. What made it worse was how peasants internalized it. After enough time, they stopped thinking of justice as something they deserved. They thought of it as something they had to survive. They didn't ask for fairness. They asked for leniency. Please, not the whip. Please, not the ox. Please, not the daughter. They bargained like beggars at a feast they were never invited to. And yet, beneath it all, something burned. Not rebellion. Rebellion needed strength, and strength was in short supply, but something quieter. A bitterness. A memory. They remembered who had been taken, who had been fined, who had been punished for speaking. They told their children, whispered stories about how justice was blind, deaf, and cruel, about how you must always bow, but never forget who stepped on your back. Luca held those stories close, especially when the steward passed by, nose in the air, counting sheep that weren't his, especially when the priest preached humility from his seat of carved oak while Luca sat on the floor. He remembered every injustice, not because he hoped to change them, but because forgetting meant losing himself entirely. There was no justice for the poor, but there was memory. And memory, even broken and bleeding, was something the law could never fully take. Chapter 10, Love, Marriage and Misery. Marriage in the peasant world wasn't about love. It was about survival. A pairing of hands, not hearts. You married because you needed help milking the goat, because someone had to keep the fire going when you were in the field, because winter was long and cold beds made you weak. Luca had married Marika at 16, she was 14. They hadn't spoken more than a few words before the ceremony, but that was normal. He remembered the way her eyes never met his, how her hands fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve, how she cried quietly the first night they shared a bed, not because he'd hurt her, but because it meant childhood was over. The wedding feast had been modest. Bread, some weak mead, and a goose one of the uncles borrowed from the manor coop. A fiddle played, people danced in muddy shoes, and someone vomited behind the chapel. A perfect village wedding, really. No one asked if Marika was ready. Readiness wasn't a luxury for girls. She had her first child before she turned 16, buried her second before 18. Luca tried to be gentle, but gentleness didn't always matter. What mattered was getting up at dawn, hauling water, feeding children who didn't stop crying, sewing in the dark, giving when there was nothing left to give. And the church, ever helpful, had plenty to say about it. A good wife was obedient, silent, fertile, tired ideally. Too much laughter, a sign of looseness. Too many opinions, dangerous. It wasn't written in scripture, at least, not the parts anyone actually read, but it was gospel nonetheless. The priest delivered sermons on Eve's sin at least once a month. He never mentioned Adam's weakness. That would be impolite. Marriages weren't equal, not legally, not spiritually. A man could beat his wife for insubordination and still be welcomed in the chapel. A woman who spoke out against her husband was labelled a serpent. If a woman left her marriage, even to escape abuse, she was cursed, shunned, sometimes even excommunicated. They called it abandonment. She called it staying alive. Luca had seen it with his own eyes. Katya, from the neighbouring village, had fled her husband after he broke 3 of her fingers for spilling stew. She returned home to her parents, only to be dragged back by the steward 3 days later. "Not your choice," he said, and gave her back like a goat that had wandered too far. She never smiled again. Of course, not all marriages were cruel. Some grew into something resembling tenderness. Luca and Marika had. Over the years, shared hardship carved space for kindness. They learned each other's silences, respected each other's grief. They found small comforts, the way she folded his shirt just so, the way he saved her the warmest part of the hearth. But love, the kind with poems and passion and candlelit confessions, was a city indulgence. Something for nobles and drunk minstrels. In the village, love was handing your spouse the last piece of bread and pretending you weren't hungry. Romance was survival made soft. Still, the system bled into everything. Dowries were negotiated like livestock trades. Girls were often promised before their first blood. The smaller the family's farm, the earlier they gave the daughter away. Another mouth to feed turned into a bargaining chip. It wasn't cruelty, it was arithmetic. And childbearing? That was the job. A woman wasn't considered complete until she'd birthed at least one son. Daughters were fine useful for chores, eventually traded for favours, but sons secured the family name, kept the land, bore the weight of future taxes. If a woman failed to produce children, the whispers started. She's barren, cursed, tainted. The husband might be the issue, but no one ever blamed him. Midwives were the true lifelines. They knew how to deliver a breech baby in the dark, how to bind a torn womb with sheep's gut and prayer, how to bury an infant without a scream. They carried knowledge passed down through generations, untaught, unrecognized, deeply sacred. And still, they were treated like shadows, called upon, then dismissed, revered, then feared. When childbirth went wrong, it was called God's will. When it went right, it was called luck. When a girl came of age in the village, there was no celebration, no flowers in the hair, no feast, just one quiet evening when her mother looked at her differently and began to speak in lowered tones. That was how it began, the preparation, not for love, but for being chosen. Marika remembered the day her mother stopped calling her child and started saying things like, "Sit straight, cover your hair, smile less, men don't trust laughter." Instructions disguised as care. Because the truth was, her worth was about to be appraised. Not by heart or humour or mind, but by hips, hands and obedience. Courtship, if it could be called that, was a negotiation. The boy's family would ask, "How much land will she bring? Can she spin wool? Has she bled yet? If yes, how regularly? If not, how soon?" These were not seen as invasive questions. They were practicalities. The marriage market wasn't emotional, it was economic. Sometimes the bride had a say, usually not. Marika had been lucky. Luca wasn't cruel, and he didn't look at her like she was property. But many others weren't so fortunate. There were girls who sobbed behind barns, wiping their faces before stepping into the chapel. Others who bore children by men who'd never once asked their opinion. No one called it rape. It was marriage. And once married, the weight only grew. Women became caretakers of everything, the fire, the food, the children, the old, the sick, the dying. They aged fast. Skin roughened by boiling water and scrubbing floors, backs bent from hauling kindling, eyes dimmed by candlelight and too little sleep. It was said that a woman in her 30s looked 50, and she often felt older. Widowhood was no release. If anything, it was a new prison. A woman without a husband lost status. She became a burden to her children if they survived, or a target of suspicion. Was her husband's death natural? Was she seen talking to another man too soon? Was she planning to remarry? Was she, God forbid, enjoying her independence? A widow who smiled too often was considered dangerous. One who spoke her mind was almost certainly hiding something. The church didn't help. They reminded women that Eve's punishment was pain, submission, and servitude. They never once mentioned how Adam also disobeyed, or how God had made both from dust. It was always about her body, her silence, her sins. And yet, in corners where no priest ventured, women created their own kind of communion. Marika would gather with the other wives in the baking shed, where the heat fogged the windows and the men stayed away. There, voices softened. Secrets passed hand to hand like loaves. Stories were told in murmurs, some funny, some horrifying, all laced with the understanding that they were in this together. One day, an older woman named Olena had whispered about how to slow a pregnancy using crushed herbs and rabbit fat. Another spoke of how to tell when a fevered child would live or not by the colour of the breath, she said. There was no magic in it, only memory. Passed from woman to woman like sacred scripture no man would ever read. These weren't witches, they were survivors. They built sisterhoods in the shadows. They laughed at things they couldn't change. They screamed when the door was closed. And they endured. Endurance wasn't just a trait, it was a skill. It was what women were taught before anything else. Not how to read or write, but how to persist. Marika once asked her mother if life ever got easier. Her mother had paused, wiping her hands on her apron, and said, "It gets different, and then you die." It wasn't said with cruelty, it was said with peace. As if dying was just another task on the list. Luca knew this, though he rarely said it aloud. He tried, in small ways, to share the weight. He carried water when he could, let Marika sleep an extra hour when the baby was restless, rubbed her feet by the fire in the dead of winter. It wasn't enough, not by half, but it was something. Chapter 11, Faith, Fear, and the Fire of the Church. In Eastern Europe's medieval villages, the church wasn't just a building, it was a presence. A looming eye watching from a crooked tower, a whisper in every sickness, a reason for every misfortune. It told you when to wake, when to kneel, when to fast, and when to fear. For the peasants, it offered salvation with one hand and punishment with the other. And more often than not, it was the backhand they felt first. Luca didn't remember the first time he stepped into the church. It was just always there. Cold stone walls, thick with incense smoke, candles guttering in corners. A heavy silence broken only by the rasp of prayer, or the priest's voice cracking through the gloom. For most villagers, it was the only stone building they'd ever enter. The one place you were meant to feel awe, but awe bled quickly into intimidation. The priest in Luca's village wasn't a bad man, but he was tired, cynical, educated just enough to feel superior, poor enough to envy the Boyar, devout enough to fear hell, but not enough to understand grace. He delivered sermons that were less about hope and more about obedience. Sin, wrath, and eternal fire were his greatest hits. Sundays weren't rest days. They were compulsory confession and moral inspection. Everyone had to attend Mass. Missing it, even for illness, was frowned upon. Miss twice and your name might be whispered. Miss 3 times and you'd be questioned. Because if you didn't fear God, what else might you defy? Marika once tried to stay home during a harsh winter storm. The baby had a cough. Her own legs were weak and snow had packed the path from their hut to the church knee-deep. She hesitated at the threshold just once. A neighbour saw her, told the priest. She was scolded publicly the following week, shamed before the altar. The cough turned into a fever, and to this day, Marika believed the priest blamed her for that too. But more than fear, it was guilt that tied the villagers to the altar. From their earliest memories, peasants were taught they were sinful by nature, poor not because of feudal injustice, but because of spiritual failure, that their suffering was God's will, that hunger made them holy, that wealth was dangerous, but curiously, only for other people. The Boyar, dressed in velvet, rarely attended Mass. When he did, he sat in a private pew, was blessed personally, and never confessed aloud, yet no priest ever questioned his soul. Luca used to wonder why. Was wealth a sign of God's favour or man's theft? The answer changed depending on who you asked, and whether they were starving. The church took tithes. 1/10 of a peasant's harvest. Not a suggestion, a requirement. Even if a crop failed, even if rats ate the grain, even if your own children gnawed bark to quiet their bellies, you tithed, or you were punished, spiritually and socially. Some tried to hide portions, dig cellars beneath huts, bury sacks in the woods, but the priest wasn't blind, and he had allies, those who feared excommunication more than betrayal. Informants, neighbours who whispered in exchange for favour or relief. It created a culture where even faith turned into suspicion. Luca once overheard an old man, Gregor, whisper to the stars, "If God made me poor to test my faith, he should know unfailing." He said it half joking, half weeping. The next week, Gregor was barred from communion, not because he had cursed, but because he had questioned. Doubt was the ultimate sin. The church dictated everything, when to marry, when to bury, what herbs could be used, what songs could be sung. Midwives needed blessing, bread had to be marked. Bells rang not just for mass, but for storms, births, eclipses. Each event turned into a warning. Fear wrapped itself around every aspect of daily life. Not the fear of bandits or hunger, those were real physical threats. But the spiritual dread, that maybe you were wrong, that maybe you were already damned and didn't even know it. And the confessional didn't offer relief. It was a box of shame. You stepped inside, whispered your failings, and hoped the priest was merciful that day. But often, he wasn't. Confession was used to control, not cleanse. To remind the sinner that forgiveness had a price. Women especially bore the heaviest spiritual burden. Their bodies were seen as temptation, their voices as rebellion. Marika had been told as a child that every pain she felt was Eve's fault, that her body was a vessel for life and sin in equal measure, that her worth was measured in purity and silence. The church gave peasants rituals, but rarely gave them comfort. And yet somehow they still believed. Luca did in his own way, not in the priest, not in the institution, but in something beyond the fields, beyond the cruelty, in the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was something watching that didn't hate them. Sometimes, while walking alone at dusk, with the sun bleeding red over the trees, he'd stop and just breathe. And in that moment, with no Latin words and no incense, he felt more spiritual than in any stone room. He didn't know what to call it, but it was real, and it didn't judge him. Others found their faith in song. Old, wordless melodies hummed while grinding grain, or in the rhythm of the loom, or in the moment when a baby stopped crying and finally slept. They built altars in their hearts, because the one in the chapel had no room for them. The church taught them about heaven, but it was always so far away. Luca wasn't sure he wanted golden angels. He just wanted rest. A place where no steward shouted, no priest scolded, no winter came early. A place where Marika's hands weren't always sore, where children didn't cough themselves silent. Maybe that was heaven. And maybe, just maybe, it could begin with remembering that faith was bigger than fear. If you'd asked Luca what holiness looked like, he'd have paused a while before answering, because it wasn't the priest with his sour breath and golden cross. It wasn't the relic in the chapel, the cracked bone in a glass box that no one could quite name. And it definitely wasn't the holy book in Latin that no one in the village could read. No holiness, if it existed, was quieter than that. Stranger. Found in the way Marika whispered a prayer over their children before sleep, or how the old midwife hummed the same melody every time she delivered a baby, as if the tune itself held off death. The church liked to claim ownership over the sacred, but the peasants, poor and forgotten as they were, still carved out something of their own. Their faith had roots deeper than doctrine, a blend of Christianity, old forest beliefs, and sheer instinct, something ancient, something the church tried to erase, but never quite could. They still tied ribbons to trees, whispered to rivers, left offerings in dark corners of barns where animals had died. The priest called it superstition, sin, pagan nonsense, but the peasants knew better. Those rituals had kept them alive long before a robed man with a candle decided what was holy. Take relics, for example. The church prized them, claimed miracles lived in the fingernail of a saint or a tear-stained cloth. They charged visitors coin to see them, preached of divine power emanating from splinters of the true cross, of which, curiously, hundreds existed across Europe. It became a market of belief, holiness for sale. But did the relics ever stop a fever, bring rain, feed the hungry? Luca had his doubts. He'd once walked 12 miles with a neighbour to visit a shrine said to cure lameness. The Boyar's cousin had been healed there, or so the priest claimed. Luca's friend, old Piotr, had a twisted foot from a childhood break. He limped there in hope. They arrived dusty, blistered, bones aching. Piotr knelt, prayed, cried. He limped home the same way he came. The priest shrugged. God's will. Faith became a performance. Pilgrimages were another way the church asserted control. The idea was simple: walk far, suffer much, and maybe, if you were lucky, heaven would take notice. Villagers scraped together food, begged for leave from their fields, and trudged across dangerous terrain in the hope of redemption. It was less about destination than humiliation. Blisters, sickness, robbers. Some never returned. The irony? The Boyar could buy indulgences, paper documents that forgave sins for a price. No walking, no praying, just silver. It turned salvation into a transaction. And yet the people still went, not because they trusted the institution, but because they needed to believe in something. When you buried a child, when the rains refused to come, when your back gave out and your hands bled and your husband grew distant, you needed a reason not to crumble. A hope, even hollow, was better than none. So they invented rituals, personal ones, real ones. Luca watched Marika trace a cross on their daughter's forehead with soot before sending her to fetch water, not because the church told her to, but because her mother had done the same. He once caught his son burying a feather and a stone behind the pigsty. To keep the foxes away, the boy said. It wasn't in the Bible, but it felt right. The old ways lingered in lullabies, in herbs strung above doors, in the way they greeted the moon as if it were listening. They didn't call it worship, just living. The church hated that. Chapter 12, Death and What Came After. In the world Luca knew, death was not a moment. It was a rhythm. It came with the frost, with the cough that wouldn't leave, with the fall from a ladder, with the bad grain. It came when you were old, if you were lucky. More often it came young, unexpected, quiet, and cruel. Peasants didn't fear death because it was rare. They feared it because it was constant. It hung around like fog, settled into beds, slept beside the children, sat at the dinner table when there was only turnip broth to eat. People got used to it, not numb, just resigned. Luca had dug too many graves by the time he was 35. He'd lost a baby to fever, a sister to childbirth, a neighbour to a falling tree, and 2 cousins to the same winter night. He remembered carrying frozen bodies in silence, no weeping, just stiff legs, stiff arms, and a prayer whispered with lips too cold to move. There were no headstones, just wooden crosses that rotted before the memory did. The graveyard was small and always full. Children were buried in shallow corners wrapped in cloth without names. Older villagers had their spots near the chapel wall, closer to God, they said. The rest, wherever there was room. Burials were quick, sometimes shared, dirt over bone, and move on. The priest read the same lines over every body. Ashes to ashes. It didn't matter if the person had been kind or cruel, loved or hated. Death erased identity, made everyone equal, but not in the way justice might. In the way fire consumes everything without care. But what came after? That was the question. The church, ever consistent, had answers. Heaven, if you obeyed. Hell, if you didn't. Purgatory, if your soul needed a rinse. These places were described in detail. Fires, angels, endless suffering, endless song, depends who you asked. The problem was, none of the villagers really knew what they'd done wrong. Were they sinners for surviving? For missing mass because of childbirth? For cursing under their breath when the wheat failed again? Marika often wondered if sorrow itself was a sin. She once asked the priest what happened to unbaptized babies. He avoided her eyes and said something about limbo and God's mercy. It didn't sound like mercy. It sounded like bureaucracy. The villagers created their own beliefs to fill the gaps. They said souls lingered near the body for 3 days, that candles left burning would guide the dead home, that dreams weren't just dreams, but messages from beyond. They told tales of a woman who saw her dead husband in the river mist, smiling, of a child who pointed at an empty chair and said, "Grandpa's here." The church hated those stories, called them heresy. But they comforted the people more than Scripture ever could. Luca didn't fear hell. He feared leaving Marika alone, feared her hands trembling without his, her grief sharpening into silence. He feared dying without telling his children how proud he was, even if he never found the words. That was his hell. And what of dying itself? There was no ceremony in it, no dramatic last words, just fading. Sometimes fast, sometimes slow. A cough that became blood, a wound that wouldn't heal, a chill that sank too deep. People died in beds, on paths, in fields. Alone or surrounded, it didn't matter. Death came all the same. Funerals were brief. A box if you had wood. A shroud if you didn't. Wailing was discouraged. Show too much grief, and people began whispering about ghosts and curses. It was better to nod solemnly and say, God's will. But sometimes grief slipped out sideways. Luca remembered when Piotr lost his wife. The man didn't speak for weeks. Then one morning he was seen planting flowers, wild, useless flowers along the edge of her grave. No one stopped him. Even the priest kept quiet. Grief had a language beyond rules. And then there was the fire. One spring, lightning struck the thatched chapel roof. The flames took it in minutes. The altar burned. The relic cracked. The priest wept. But the villagers? They didn't scream. They didn't panic. They watched. When the fire died, they stood in the ash, blinking. Then slowly, they walked home. Luca remembered someone muttering, "Guess we're closer to heaven now." The priest rebuilt the chapel, but something changed after that. The people prayed softer, less desperate. They still attended Mass, but their eyes wandered more. They looked at the sky, the soil, each other, as if holiness might live there instead. Because, after so much death, so much loss, how could one still pretend that faith lived only in stone? Maybe the greatest truth the peasants ever knew was this: life was pain, and death was certain. But between those two, there was bread and song and warm hands. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was salvation. Luca didn't need a golden gate. He needed rest, peace, a fire that didn't burn down homes, a God who saw tired people and didn't demand more from them. And if that wasn't heaven, then heaven was overrated. Luca had always noticed how different people looked just before they died. Not in the way their bodies gave out, he'd seen plenty of that, but in their eyes. Some were wide and terrified, clutching at bedsheets like they might pull themselves back into life. Others looked beyond him, as if already seeing something no one else could. And some, like old Anya, just sighed, as if dying was more of a release than a tragedy. For peasants, death was rarely a surprise. You didn't need a priest to tell you when the end was near. The breath changed. The skin went waxy. The spirit slowly stopped responding to pain. The real struggle was in what came after. Not for the dead, but for those left behind. The rituals, if you could call them that, were practical. The body had to be washed, usually by women, quietly and without ceremony. Water heated, cloth prepared, eyes closed with fingers. It wasn't sacred, not in the way the church described, but it was intimate. The last kindness. The only control you had over the inevitable. Then came the priest, late more often than not. He'd recite from memory, barely glancing at the dead. His words were meant for the living, to remind them they were still sinners, still watched, still one mistake away from damnation. It wasn't comfort, it was warning. Confession was supposed to be the great release, but few peasants got the chance for a proper one. Dying was messy, sudden. There was no time to call the priest when someone fell from a ladder or bled out in childbirth. And so the fear grew of dying unclean, of being buried without absolution, of wandering purgatory for 1,000 years. To fix that, the church offered a service. Pay a little more, a few eggs, a sack of barley, and prayers would be said on your behalf. Special masses. Chants. If you were really generous, they might ring the bell. Of course, generosity was hard to afford when your family was already starving. Luca once tried to arrange a proper burial for his cousin Thomas's. The man had died in winter, splitting firewood. His heart just stopped. Luca went to the priest, asked about a blessing. The priest asked what the family could give. Luca offered bread and a bottle of mead. The priest sneered. Do you think God drinks scraps? So Tomazar was buried without fanfare, just a cross made from broken cartwood. No bell, no sermon, no mention of his kindness, or the way he helped neighbours even when he had nothing. Just silence. Marika cried that night not for Thomas's, but for the way he was forgotten. That was the truth behind death in the village. You weren't afraid of dying, you were afraid of being erased. But still, the people resisted in their own ways. Old women whispered prayers not found in scripture. Herbs were tucked into the shroud, lavender, yarrow, fennel, to protect the soul. Candles were lit in doorways. Windows opened so the spirit could escape. These rituals weren't in the Bible, but they were theirs. And in doing them, the peasants reclaimed something sacred, not because the church allowed it, because the church never understood what it meant to die in the mud, with no gold, no hymns, no legacy, just the memory of a few calloused hands and a name that would fade by spring. Children were taught not to fear the dead, to respect them, to remember. Luca's youngest daughter once placed a flower by the fire and said, "For Tomase." He liked sunflowers. No one had told her to, she just knew. It wasn't a ritual, it was a heartbeat, a refusal to forget. Peasant cemeteries didn't have marble or iron. They had dirt, weathered wood and wildflowers. They shifted every spring as roots moved bones and rain washed names away. But somehow the dead still stayed, not in the ground, in stories, in the way their sons sharpened blades, in the way their daughters sang while kneading dough. Sometimes Luca would walk to the edge of the graveyard, not to visit anyone in particular, but to be reminded that life wasn't the only thing worth noticing, that those who'd passed weren't lost, just silent. He once found a bundle of herbs tied to a tree by the graves, a charm, not church approved, but old, powerful in its own way, tied with care. That small act spoke louder than any sermon, because that's how the peasants handled death, with defiance, with tenderness, with the kind of holiness the church never wrote down. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to earn them peace in the next world, even if the one they lived in had offered them none. If I were a peasant in that time, I think the hardest pill to swallow wouldn't have been death itself, but the way it was used to control us. Imagine living your entire life knowing that your end will be cold, muddy, and probably forgotten. Unless, of course, you pay the church its due, say your Latin prayers, confess to the same tired sins, and die on schedule with a priest hovering by your bed. That's not faith. That's bureaucracy with incense. Let's not romanticize it. Death back then was a business, a moral checklist, a trap disguised as salvation. And the church, they ran the market. Couldn't pay for a burial mass? Well then, your soul just might take the scenic route through purgatory. Didn't have enough barley to buy a few Hail Marys. Tough luck. You'll rot in both worlds. Here's the real criticism. These peasants, they weren't stupid. They were trapped. Illiterate, overworked, fed lies in Latin, and told their pain was divine punishment. But what really burns is how the church hoarded knowledge. Imagine if just one of them could have read. One farmer with a hidden book could have unravelled the system, but literacy was gate-kept, kept holy, kept profitable. Now, if I were there, knowing what I know, I wouldn't have tried to overthrow the priest or challenge Rome. That's a good way to get hung upside down in the village square. No, I'd have started small. First, I'd keep a journal. Not some fancy manuscript, just scratches on bark, bits of memory, a local herbal cure that worked, which moon cycle helped the birth go smoother. Oral history was their lifeline, and recording that quietly could turn survival into wisdom. Second, I'd build alliances, not with the boyar or the priest. They already had their seats in heaven paid for. I'm talking about the midwife, the blacksmith, the grandmother who remembers old songs. Collect their knowledge, share it without calling it heresy, reclaim the rituals the church tried to stamp out. And third, I'd teach the children, not just prayers, but patterns. The signs of sickness before it spreads, how the stars shift with the seasons, when the land starts whispering warnings. In a world where death was a constant, even the smallest shared knowledge could be a rebellion. Because in truth, Their strength wasn't just in enduring. It was in how they honoured their dead, not with coins or candles, but with memory, with grief that became stories, with graves that bloomed with wild flowers, even after names faded. If the church built its power on fear of the afterlife, then knowledge, quiet, stubborn, handmade knowledge, was the real salvation peasants could have used. They just didn't have the time or the space to write it down. But if one of them had, maybe we wouldn't be guessing so much now.